Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of the most remarkable lives in English history, Alfred the Great, the only English king ever honoured with that title, who saved England from the Vikings between 871 and 899 AD. We'll softly explore his incredible journey from a young prince who never expected to rule, through the darkest hours hiding in marshlands, to his triumphant victory at the Battle of Edington, and his remarkable transformation of a kingdom into a nation. Along the way, we'll discover his military genius, his passion for learning, and the reforms that laid the foundation for England itself. Before you drift into peaceful slumber, if you're enjoying this gentle journey through time, please take a moment to give this video a like. It truly helps others find these calming tales. And if you're feeling brave enough, leave a comment below, even just a simple word about your favorite part of Alfred's story, or which historical figure you'd like to hear about next. I know some of you are shy, and that's perfectly okay. Even a single emoji means the world to us here at Sleepy Crown. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers who love falling asleep to history's whispers. So settle into your softest blankets, close your eyes, and let the story of England's greatest king carry you gently toward restful sleep. Welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, entered this world around the year 849 in the royal estate of Wantage, nestled in the district of Berkshire, where box trees grew abundantly in the ancient Burh wood. He arrived as the fifth son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex and his first wife Osburh, a woman described by chroniclers as most religious, noble in character, and noble by birth. In that time, in that place, the birth of a fifth son seemed an unlikely path to greatness. 3 older brothers stood between young Alfred and the throne of Wessex, and in the turbulent world of 9th century England, the youngest prince had every reason to expect a life in the shadows of power, rather than at its centre. The kingdom Alfred was born into was one of 4 major Anglo-Saxon realms that divided the island of Britain. Wessex controlled the southwest, its borders reaching from the wild coast to the fertile valleys inland. To the north lay Mercia, a powerful kingdom that stretched across the Midlands. Further north still stood Northumbria, ancient and proud, while to the east, East Anglia faced the cold waters of the North Sea. These kingdoms had existed for generations, each with their own kings, their own customs, their own dreams of dominance. But beyond the horizon, across those same cold waters, other dreams were stirring, dreams of conquest, of plunder, of new lands to claim. The Vikings were coming, though in Alfred's childhood, no one yet understood the magnitude of the storm that approached. Alfred's father, Ethelwulf, was a king of considerable stature, a man who had inherited his throne from the legendary Egbert, who had briefly united much of England under his rule. Ethelwulf's name in Old English meant noble wolf, a fitting title for a ruler who needed both nobility and ferocity to maintain his kingdom in those uncertain times. The king had 6 children with Osburh, and Alfred, arriving last among the sons, must have seemed destined for a quiet life, perhaps service in the church, or governance of some distant estate. His eldest brother, Aethelstan, was already old enough to be appointed sub-king of Kent, nearly 10 years before Alfred drew his first breath. The succession seemed secure, laid out in orderly progression through the older brothers. But young Alfred possessed something that would prove more valuable than proximity to the throne. An insatiable love of learning and a mind that absorbed knowledge like parched earth drinks rain. His mother, Queen Osburh, recognized this hunger in her youngest son. One day, she gathered her children and showed them a beautifully illuminated volume of Saxon poetry, its pages adorned with intricate designs and vibrant colours that must have seemed almost magical to young eyes. She made a promise that would change Alfred's life. The book would belong to the first of her sons, who could memorize and recite its verses. While his older brothers may have seen this as a pleasant diversion, young Alfred approached it with determination that belied his tender years. Though he could not yet read, an irony that would haunt him into adulthood, Alfred had the verses read aloud to him again and again, committing each word, each rhythm, each subtle turn of phrase to his memory. When he stood before his mother and flawlessly recited the poetry back to her, earning the precious book as his prize, he was only 6 years old. That moment revealed something essential about the boy who would become England's saviour. He possessed not just intelligence, but the discipline to pursue knowledge with single-minded focus, and the wisdom to recognise that learning was a treasure worth any effort. The world beyond Wessex began calling to young Alfred while he was still a child. In the year 853, when he was barely 4 or 5 years old, his father made a momentous decision. King Ethelwulf would make a pilgrimage to Rome, the Eternal City, the heart of Christendom, and he would take his youngest son with him. This was no small journey in the 9th century. The route stretched across the Channel to Francia, then south through lands ruled by Charlemagne's descendants, over the formidable Alps, and finally down into the Italian peninsula. For a child of Alfred's age, the journey must have been an adventure beyond imagination. Seeing cities larger than anything in England, hearing languages he couldn't understand, witnessing the grandeur of continental courts that dwarfed the wooden halls of Wessex. In Rome, young Alfred was received by Pope Leo IV himself, the Holy Father, who led the Christian world from his seat in the ancient city. What transpired during that audience would later be remembered in different ways by different chroniclers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled years later during Alfred's own reign, recorded that the Pope anointed the young prince as king, a claim that some historians view with skepticism. After all, Alfred had 3 older brothers still living, making such an anointing seem premature at best. More likely, the Pope performed some ceremony of blessing or confirmation, marking the young prince as special in the eyes of the Church, a spiritual anointing rather than a political one. But whether the details were embroidered in later retellings or not, the journey left its mark on Alfred. He saw the glory of Rome, the organized might of the Church, the sophisticated learning preserved in monasteries and scriptoria. Seeds were planted that would bloom decades later in his own reforms. 2 years later, in 855, Alfred made the journey to Rome again, this time accompanying his father for a longer stay. King Ethelwulf spent a full year in the Holy City, fulfilling religious obligations and strengthening political ties with the papal court. For the young prince, now 6 or 7 years old, this extended sojourn allowed him to witness the workings of a Christian empire in a way few Englishmen of his generation ever would. He may have attended services in the great basilicas, walked streets first paved by Roman emperors centuries before, and perhaps most significantly, encountered the learning preserved in the church's libraries. The contrast between Rome's stone grandeur and Wessex's wooden halls must have been striking to a child's eyes. On the journey home from this second pilgrimage, father and son stopped at the court of Charles the Bald, King of West Francia, and grandson of the legendary Charlemagne, who had created a brief renaissance of learning in his empire earlier in the century. Charles's court still maintained some of that intellectual tradition, and young Alfred would have encountered scholars, clerics, and nobles who valued education as much as martial prowess. This exposure to Carolingian culture, to the idea that a king should be learned as well as strong, would profoundly influence Alfred's vision of what leadership could be. But the visit to Charles's court brought changes Alfred hadn't anticipated. His father, now aging and perhaps aware of his mortality, made a surprising decision. He would marry Charles's daughter, Judith, a girl of perhaps 12 or 13 years old. This marriage alliance strengthened ties between Wessex and Francia, but it created complications at home that young Alfred was too young to fully understand. The family Alfred returned to was not the one he had left. During the long absence in Rome and Francia, his eldest, surviving brother, Ethelbald, had grown resentful. Some accounts suggest that Ethelbald, left as regent in his father's absence, had actually attempted to seize the throne for himself, refusing to relinquish power when Ethelwulf returned. The aged king, perhaps weary from his long journey, perhaps hoping to avoid civil war, made a compromise that split his kingdom. Ethelbald would rule Wessex proper, while Ethelwulf contented himself with the sub-kingdom of Kent. For young Alfred, returning home to find his family divided and his father diminished must have been a harsh lesson in the realities of power. He learned that even the most legitimate authority could be challenged, that strength and cunning sometimes mattered more than right, and that peace sometimes required compromise that tasted bitter. But young Alfred's education in the darker aspects of royal life was only beginning. In 858, barely a year after his return from Francia, his father, King Ethelwulf, died. The circumstances of his final months, sharing power with a rebellious son while trying to maintain dignity and order, must have weighed heavily on the old king. With his death, Ethelbald took full control of Wessex, and in a move that scandalized the court and the church alike, he married his father's widow, Judith. To the Christian sensibilities of the time, this was close to incest, a son taking his father's wife, even though Judith had never been Ethelbald's mother. The bishop denounced it, chroniclers recorded their horror, but Ethelbald held power and seemed indifferent to moral outrage. Young Alfred, perhaps 9 years old, witnessed how quickly the world could change, how the rules that governed ordinary people could bend or break when confronted with royal ambition. Alfred's mother, Osburh, had already passed from this world, dying when her youngest son was about 6 years old, just before or after those formative journeys to Rome. Her death deprived Alfred of the parent who had first recognized and nurtured his love of learning, the one who had given him that precious book of poetry as reward for his dedication. Without her gentle influence, without his father's steady hand, young Alfred found himself in a court ruled by a brother whose actions suggested that power justified itself, that tradition and morality were obstacles to be circumvented rather than principles to be honored. These were dark lessons for a prince who would one day need to rule with both strength and justice. Yet Ethelbald's reign proved mercifully brief. Death came for him in 860, barely 2 years after he had claimed both kingdom and stepmother. With his passing, the crown of Wessex passed to the next brother in line, Ethelbert, who had been ruling Kent as a sub-kingdom, and now united it with Wessex under his single rule. Ethelbert's reign was quieter, more conventional, less marked by scandal. For 5 years, he governed both territories, and for young Alfred, now entering his teenage years, this period offered some stability. The boy who loved learning continued his education, though he remained unable to read on his own, a source of frustration that would persist for decades. He listened to poems and histories read aloud, memorized vast amounts of verse and lore, developed his mind even as his body grew stronger through the martial training expected of a young prince. But even as Alfred studied and trained, the world beyond Wessex's borders was changing in ways that would soon sweep away the relative peace of his adolescence. The year 865 marked a turning point, not just for England, but for young Alfred, who had now lived for 16 or 17 years in a world that, while troubled, had remained fundamentally recognizable. That summer, a fleet of ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of East Anglia, their distinctive curved prows cutting through the waves, their crews singing songs in a harsh northern tongue. These were not the raiding parties that had plagued England's coast for decades, hitting monasteries and towns before vanishing back across the sea with their plunder. This was something far more ominous, an army, organized and enormous, with no intention of sailing home when winter came. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles would name it, had arrived to conquer. The estimates of the army's size varied wildly in the sources that survived. Some chroniclers, prone to exaggeration when describing pagan enemies, suggested vast hordes that blackened the landscape. More cautious modern historians suggest perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 warriors at the core, though with support personnel, families, and camp followers, the total could have swelled much higher. What matters more than the precise number is what the army represented: a coordinated effort from multiple Scandinavian regions, a force that combined warriors from Denmark, Norway, and possibly Sweden, all united under leaders whose names would echo through history: Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubbe, brothers who some claimed were sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The story the Vikings told about why they had come mixed mythology with history in ways that made truth hard to discern. According to Norse sagas written centuries later, Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking king, had been captured during a raid on Northumbria and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes by King Ella of Northumbria. As the snake struck and poison coursed through his veins, Ragnar supposedly sang his death song, and his final words called for vengeance. His sons, hearing of their father's gruesome death, gathered warriors from across Scandinavia and sailed for England to make King Ella pay for what he had done. The saga painted their invasion as a blood feud made holy by filial duty, a quest for honor that justified any amount of destruction. But the reality, as with most things, was likely more complex and more practical. The Great Heathen Army came to England because England was rich and divided, because its kingdoms fought among themselves instead of presenting a united front, because its monasteries overflowed with gold and silver, worked into crosses and reliquaries, because its land could support larger populations than the rocky farms of Scandinavia. They came because they could, because previous generations of Viking raiders had shown that English kingdoms would pay enormous sums in silver rather than fight, because the opportunity for wealth and land and glory called to ambitious men seeking their fortunes. Whether Ragnar's death provided the spark or merely the excuse, the invasion would have come regardless, driven by forces larger than any individual revenge. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, on the eastern coast where the flat lands stretched toward the horizon, and rivers provided highways into the interior. King Edmund of East Anglia, faced with this unprecedented force, made a decision that must have seemed wise at the time. He bought peace, not with silver alone, though surely that changed hands, but with something far more valuable: horses. The Vikings were sea warriors, raiders who struck from ships and retreated to them for safety. But to conquer and hold territory inland, they needed to move with speed across land, needed to carry supplies and weapons, needed to match the mobility of English armies. Edmund gave them the horses they needed to transform from ship-bound raiders into a mobile land army. Whether he hoped this would satisfy them and send them elsewhere, or whether he simply had no choice but to yield to their demands, the result was the same. The Vikings now possessed the means to strike deep into England's heart. Through that winter of 865 into 866, the Great Heathen Army camped in East Anglia, horses grazing in English pastures, warriors preparing weapons and planning their next move. They had no intention of leaving. The following year, they struck north, leaving East Anglia nominally independent but cowed, riding their newly acquired horses toward Northumbria. The great northern kingdom was in chaos, torn by civil war between King Osbert, the legitimate ruler, and Ella, a usurper who had seized York and claimed the throne for himself. In November of 866, while these two rivals were locked in their power struggle, the Viking army swept into York, the ancient Roman city of Eberacum, the jewel of Northumbria, the most important city in northern England. York fell with shocking ease. The Vikings occupied the city, fortified it, and prepared to hold it against any counterattack. The shock of losing their capital finally drove Osbert and Ella to put aside their feud and unite their forces. In March of 867, the combined Northumbrian army launched a desperate assault to reclaim their city. The battle was fierce. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that both armies suffered heavy casualties, and the fighting must have raged through York's Roman streets and against its hastily reinforced walls. But when the blood-soaked day ended, both Northumbrian kings lay dead among the corpses of their warriors. Osbert and Ella, who had fought each other for power, died together fighting a common enemy, and with them died Northumbria as an independent kingdom. The Norse sagas remembered what happened to Ella with particular vividness and particular horror. They claimed that Ivar the Boneless, avenging his father Ragnar, subjected the captured king to the blood eagle, a ritual execution so gruesome that even seasoned warriors would have turned away. The victim would be laid face down, and then the executioner would cut through the ribs on either side of the spine, break them open like wings, and pull the lungs out through the opening to create a grotesque eagle shape. Whether this actually happened to Ella, or whether it was a story added later to emphasize the cruelty of the pagan invaders and the righteousness of the Viking revenge, remains debated by historians. What is certain is that Ella died, Northumbria fell, and the Vikings placed a puppet king named Egbert on the throne to collect taxes and maintain order while the real power rested with the conquerors. With Northumbria secure in their grasp, the Great Heathen Army turned its attention south. In 867, they marched into Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom, and established a winter camp at Nottingham. King Burh of Mercia, faced with this existential threat, did something that Alfred and his brother Ethelred could not ignore. He sent messengers galloping to Wessex, begging for help. Burh was married to Alfred's sister, Ethelswith, making this not just a political crisis, but a family one. More importantly, if Mercia fell, Wessex would stand alone against the Viking tide. King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, now about 18 years old, led an army north to their brother-in-law's aid. But when the combined forces of Wessex and Mercia reached Nottingham, they found the Vikings had fortified their position behind strong defences. The siege that followed must have frustrated the English commanders. The Vikings refused to give battle in the open, content to sit behind their walls while their enemies waited outside. Neither side could force a decisive confrontation. Eventually, exhausted and unable to break the Viking defences, the Mercians negotiated a peace. The exact terms were not recorded, but the pattern was familiar. Silver changed hands, promises were made, and the Vikings agreed to leave Mercia alone for now. They withdrew back to York, leaving Burgred's kingdom intact but weakened, having demonstrated that even united English armies could not easily dislodge them from fortified positions. For Alfred, fighting in his first major campaign against the Vikings, the lessons must have been sobering. The Vikings returned to East Anglia in 869, their hunger for conquest unsatisfied by treaties and tribute. King Edmund, who had once bought peace with horses, now faced them as enemies. The details of what happened next are shrouded in legend as much as history, but the outcome was clear enough. Edmund's army was defeated, and the king himself was captured. According to later accounts written by Christian monks, the Vikings offered Edmund a choice: renounce his Christian faith and rule as their puppet, or die. Edmund, remembered by the church as a martyr, chose death. The manner of his execution became the subject of hagiography: tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, then beheaded when he refused to deny Christ. Whether the details are accurate or embellished to create a saintly narrative, Edmund became a martyr, and his kingdom ceased to exist as an independent realm. East Anglia, like Northumbria before it, became part of the growing territory under Viking control. By the end of 870, just 5 years after the Great Heathen Army first landed, 3 of England's 4 great kingdoms had fallen. Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia were either conquered outright or reduced to puppet states paying tribute to Viking overlords. Only Wessex remained free, and Wessex would be next. Young Alfred, now about 21 years old, had watched the systematic destruction of Anglo-Saxon England. He had seen kingdoms fall one by one, had witnessed the failure of both war and diplomacy to stop the Viking advance, had learned that even united English armies struggled to defeat these northern warriors when they chose their ground carefully. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon for his entire life was now breaking directly over his head, and soon he would be called upon not just to fight in that storm, but to lead Wessex through it. The year 870 brought the war to Wessex's doorstep, and with it came the full revelation of Alfred's character as a warrior and leader. The Vikings, having subdued or cowed every other major Anglo-Saxon kingdom, turned their full attention southward to the last remaining obstacle to their domination of England. King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred prepared to defend their homeland against an enemy that had proven nearly invincible. What followed was a series of battles fought in the winter cold, a season when armies normally dispersed to their homes, but when the Vikings, already homeless conquerors, pressed their advantage, the Viking army struck at Reading, a strategically important town where the River Kennet flowed into the Thames, providing both a defensive position and access to the river highways that could supply their forces. They fortified the town, building ramparts between the 2 rivers and establishing a secure base from which to launch raids into Wessex's heartland. King Ethelred and Alfred gathered what forces they could and marched to meet this threat. The first engagement came at Englefield, 4 days before the end of the year 870, where the men of Wessex caught a Viking raiding party by surprise and drove them back with significant losses. It was a small victory, but victories against the Great Heathen Army had been rare enough that even a skirmish one could lift spirits and suggest that these northern warriors were not, after all, invincible. But the euphoria of Englefield was short-lived. 4 days into the new year of 871, on January 5th, Ethelred and Alfred led their combined forces in a direct assault on Reading itself, attempting to break through the fortifications and drive the Vikings from their stronghold. The attack was a disaster. The Vikings, led by Halfdan Ragnarsson, brother of Ivar the Boneless, had prepared their defences well. The assault broke against the ramparts like waves against rocks, and when the Vikings counterattacked, the Saxon forces were thrown back with heavy losses. Among the dead was a nobleman named Ethelwulf, recorded in the chronicles not just for his death, but because his fall represented the kind of losses Wessex could ill afford. Experienced commanders, leaders who had fought Vikings before and lived to use that experience. The defeat at Reading could have been the beginning of the end, could have been the moment when Wessex's will to resist broke, but instead, just 4 days after that humiliating loss, something remarkable happened on the Berkshire Downs. The exact location has been debated by historians for centuries. Perhaps near Compton, perhaps Aldworth, perhaps somewhere on those rolling hills that look down over the valleys below. But the place called Ashdown in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would witness one of the most significant battles of the era, and young Alfred would emerge as more than just a king's brother. The armies met on January the 8th, 871, positioning themselves on the high ground of the Berkshire Downs. The Vikings held the superior position initially, having reached the heights first, and formed their shield wall with the advantage of elevation. The Anglo-Saxon forces were divided into two commands. King Ethelred would lead one division, while Alfred commanded the other. The plan was for both divisions to attack simultaneously, catching the Vikings between two coordinated assaults. But as the moment for battle approached, as warriors on both sides worked themselves into the fury needed to face shield walls and slaughter, King Ethelred remained in his tent. Asser, Alfred's biographer and the source for many details about this battle, recorded that the king was at his prayers, hearing mass and refusing to leave until the holy service was complete. Whether Ethelred was truly that devoted to religious observance even at such a critical moment, or whether he hesitated for other reasons, fear, uncertainty, or perhaps illness, remains unknown. What is certain is that Alfred, watching the Vikings organize their defense and knowing that delay could cost them whatever advantage surprise might offer, made a decision that would define his reputation as a military leader. He did not wait for his brother. He did not send more messengers urging the king to come. Instead, relying on his own judgment and his own courage, Alfred gave the order to attack. The Battle of Ashdown became legendary in the telling, and Asser's description captures something of its ferocity. Alfred led his warriors in a furious uphill charge against the Viking shield wall, fighting like a wild boar, as Asser wrote, savage, unstoppable, driven by desperation and fury. The Vikings, holding the high ground and confident in their position, suddenly found themselves under assault from an enemy that attacked with such ferocity that their lines began to waver. The fighting must have been brutal. Shield pressed against shield, swords striking iron and flesh, men screaming and dying while their comrades stepped over fallen bodies to press the attack forward. When Ethelred finally emerged from his devotions and led his division into the battle, the fight was already fully joined. The Vikings broke. After hours of combat, after suffering heavy casualties, including 5 jarls, nobles of high rank who would not easily be replaced, the Great Heathen Army that had conquered 3 kingdoms withdrew from the field. They retreated to Reading, leaving the field to the Saxons, leaving behind their dead and their wounded. It was the first major defeat the Great Heathen Army had suffered since landing in England 6 years earlier. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical victory. The Vikings could be beaten, their shield walls could be broken, their reputation for invincibility was a lie that could be shattered by men with enough courage to stand against them. But Alfred's triumph at Ashdown, significant as it was, did not end the war or even significantly slow the Viking advance. The Great Heathen Army was too large, too well organized, and too experienced to be destroyed by a single defeat. Within weeks, they had regrouped and struck back. On January 22nd, just 2 weeks after Ashdown, the armies met again at Basing in Hampshire, and this time the result went the other way. The Saxons were defeated, their momentum from Ashdown spent, and they were forced to retreat. 2 months later, on March 22nd, another battle was fought at a place called Merton, possibly Marden in Wiltshire or Martin in Dorset. The exact location lost to time, but the outcome clear enough. Again, the Saxons were defeated, and this time the casualties included men close to King Ethelred himself. Then, Sometime in the weeks after the Battle of Merton, King Ethelred died. The exact circumstances of his death were not recorded in detail. Whether he succumbed to wounds received in battle, or whether illness claimed him during this period of constant warfare and stress, the sources do not say. What mattered was that Wessex, in the midst of an existential crisis, in the middle of what would be remembered as the Year of Battles, suddenly found itself without a king. Ethelred left behind sons, young boys who might someday claim their father's throne. But the kingdom needed a warrior king immediately, needed someone who could lead armies against an enemy that gave no quarter and showed no mercy. The choice was obvious to those who had fought at Ashdown, who had seen Alfred's courage and leadership in the moment of greatest danger. In April of 871, at the age of 21 or 22, Alfred became King of Wessex. There was no time for elaborate ceremony, no leisurely transition of power. The Vikings were still there, still dangerous, still conquering. Alfred inherited a kingdom under siege, an army exhausted by months of continuous warfare, and a people who must have wondered if resistance was even possible. The Great Heathen Army had defeated every kingdom they had targeted. Northumbria had fallen. East Anglia had fallen. Mercia was cowed and paid tribute. Now only Wessex stood, and Wessex had a new king who was barely more than a youth, untested as a ruler, even if proven as a warrior. The weight of that crown must have been almost unbearable. Alfred was not just responsible for his own survival now, but for the survival of the last free English kingdom, for the preservation of a way of life, for thousands of people who looked to their king for protection and leadership. And the enemy he faced had spent years perfecting their craft of conquest, led by experienced warlords who had broken stronger kingdoms than the one Alfred now struggled to defend. Everything Alfred had learned in his 20-some years, the lessons from Rome about organization and learning, the lessons from his troubled family about power and its costs, the lessons from Ashdown about courage and decisive action, all of it would be tested in the crucible of war that awaited him. Alfred's first days as king were baptized in blood and defeat. Shortly after his accession, perhaps even before the traditional ceremonies that would formally mark his kingship, he found himself leading the men of Wessex back into battle. The Vikings, sensing perhaps that a change in leadership might create uncertainty or weakness, pressed their advantage. The details of some of these early engagements have been lost to time, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that 9 major battles were fought in that terrible year of 871, along with countless smaller skirmishes that never made it into the historical record. 9 times, Alfred had to rally his forces, march to meet the enemy, and risk everything in the chaos of shield walls and slaughter. The Battle of Wilton, fought sometime in May after Alfred had been king for only weeks, became symbolic of the impossible position Wessex faced. Alfred led his army against the Vikings once more, and initially, the battle seemed to be going in the Saxons' favour. The shield wall held, the Vikings were being pushed back, and for a moment victory seemed within grasp. But the Vikings, with their years of experience in warfare across multiple kingdoms, employed a tactic they had used successfully before, a feigned retreat. They broke their shield wall deliberately, streaming away from the battlefield as if in panicked flight. The Saxon warriors, bloodied but triumphant, saw what appeared to be total victory and broke their own formation to pursue the fleeing enemy. It was exactly what the Vikings wanted. Once the disciplined Saxon shield wall had dissolved into individual warriors chasing what they thought was a defeated foe, the Vikings wheeled around and counterattacked. The pursuing Saxons found themselves suddenly fighting for their lives against an enemy that was neither defeated nor fleeing, but had instead turned their pursuit into a trap. The Battle of Wilton ended in Saxon defeat, and Alfred, still learning the harsh lessons of warfare against this experienced enemy, was forced to retreat with whatever forces he could salvage. The young king had fought courageously, had demonstrated tactical skill in the battle's early phases, but courage and skill were not always enough against an enemy that had perfected deception as a weapon. After Wilton, after months of continuous warfare that had drained Wessex of men and treasure, Alfred made a decision that must have tasted like ashes in his mouth. He sued for peace. The exact terms of the treaty were not recorded in detail, but the pattern established by other kingdoms suggested what Alfred likely had to agree to. Wessex would pay tribute, a massive amount of silver that emptied the kingdom's coffers and enriched the Viking army. In exchange, the Vikings would withdraw, would give Wessex breathing room, would turn their attention elsewhere. It was not a victory, not even close, but it was survival. And survival was all Alfred could achieve in that moment. The Great Heathen Army withdrew to London, that crucial trading city on the Thames, and settled in for the winter of 871-872. The peace, purchased at such heavy cost, gave Alfred his first real opportunity to consider what it meant to be King of Wessex. The crown that had seemed so distant in his childhood now pressed heavily on his brow, bringing with it responsibilities that extended far beyond the battlefield. A king needed not just to fight wars, but to build alliances, to strengthen his kingdom internally, to ensure that the next war, and there would certainly be a next war, found Wessex better prepared than it had been in that terrible year of battles. Alfred turned his attention to one of the most traditional ways of securing alliances in the medieval world: marriage. In 868, 3 years before he became king, Alfred had married Ealhswith, and that marriage now took on political significance that went beyond personal affection. Ealhswith was the daughter of Ethelred Mucil, a Mercian nobleman who held the title of Ealdorman of the Gaini, which was thought to be an ancient Mercian tribal group centred perhaps around Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. More importantly, Ealhswith's mother, Egbert, was a member of the Mercian royal family, descended from the powerful kings who had once ruled that great Midland kingdom. Through Ealhswith, Alfred had ties to Mercia, and those ties could be crucial in building the alliances Wessex needed to survive. But Ealhswith occupied a curious position in Alfred's court. Unlike queens in some other kingdoms, unlike even the wife of the Frankish king Alfred had met in his childhood, Ealhswith was never called queen. She witnessed no charters during Alfred's lifetime, played no visible role in the governance of the kingdom, remained almost invisible in the official records. This was not because Alfred disrespected her, or because she lacked intelligence or capability. Rather, it was a deliberate policy rooted in Wessex's history. Generations before, a queen named Egbert, wife of King Beorhtric, had poisoned her husband when trying to poison one of his advisors. That scandal had created such horror and anger that the title of queen was afterward denied to the wives of Wessex's kings, a punishment that extended to innocent women for the crimes of one who had come before them. Despite her lack of official title and public role, Ealhswith was clearly important to Alfred personally and politically. By 868, when they married, she had already borne him children, or would soon do so. Their first child was a daughter named Ethelfled, born around 868 or 869, who would grow up to become one of the most remarkable women in Anglo-Saxon history, the Lady of the Mercians, a ruler and warrior in her own right, who would carry on her father's work of defending England against Viking invasions. Another daughter, Ethelgifu, followed, destined from birth for the religious life. Alfred would later make her abbess of the monastery at Shaftesbury that he founded, and sometime in the early 870s, Ealhswith gave birth to a son, the boy who would be known as Edward the Elder, the heir to Wessex, and the future king who would build upon his father's foundations. These children represented more than just Alfred's personal legacy. They were tools of alliance, ways to bind other kingdoms and powers to Wessex through marriage and family ties. Daughters could be married to powerful nobles or foreign rulers, creating bonds of kinship that might prove crucial in times of crisis. Sons ensured the succession, provided leadership for the future, and demonstrated that the royal line would continue. In the uncertain world of the 870s, with Viking armies camped in London and the survival of Wessex itself in doubt, these children represented hope, the possibility that there would be a future worth preparing for. Alfred's marriage to Ealhswith had not been without personal cost, according to his biographer Asser. On his wedding day, as the festivities reached their height, and the great feast was spread before the assembled nobles and warriors, Alfred was suddenly struck by a mysterious and terrible pain. It came without warning, doubling him over, making it impossible for him to maintain the kingly composure expected at such an occasion. The pain was intense enough that it could not be hidden, could not be dismissed, and it marked the beginning of a medical mystery that would plague Alfred for the rest of his life. The exact nature of this affliction remained uncertain to the physicians of his time, who had limited knowledge and crude remedies for complex diseases. Some whispered that it was punishment from God for some unknown sin, while others suggested witchcraft or demonic possession, explanations that reflected the medieval worldview more than medical reality. Modern medical historians, analyzing Asser's descriptions of Alfred's symptoms, have suggested that the king likely suffered from Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory condition of the digestive tract that causes severe abdominal pain, fatigue, and other debilitating symptoms. The disease would come and go in waves, periods of relative health followed by attacks so severe that Alfred could not leave his chambers, could barely move, could focus on nothing but the pain consuming him. For a king who needed to lead armies, sit in judgment, oversee the administration of his kingdom, and project strength and confidence to both his own people and his enemies, this unpredictable illness was a constant trial. He learned to manage it as best he could, restricting his diet to foods that seemed to cause less distress: milk, water, vegetables, simple porridge, while the rich meats and strong ale that other warriors consumed freely often left him in agony. The 5 years following Alfred's peace treaty with the Vikings, from 871 to 876, provided Wessex with desperately needed breathing room. The Great Heathen Army turned its attention elsewhere, particularly toward completing its conquest of Mercia. In 872, the Vikings moved from London to Torksey in Lindsey, where they established a winter camp. The Northumbrians, still restive under their puppet king, attempted a rebellion that year, ejecting King Egbert and placing another ruler named Rixig on the throne. But the Vikings swiftly moved north, crushed the rebellion, and reimposed their control, though they managed to subdue only the southern portion of Northumbria called Derra, leaving the northern region somewhat more independent. The pattern was clear. The Vikings were not just conquering, they were settling, establishing control systems that would allow them to exploit their conquered territories for years to come. In 874, the Great Heathen Army, which had operated as a unified force for nearly a decade, finally split into 2 separate commands. Halfdan Ragnarsson took his followers north, establishing himself in Northumbria and beginning the process of permanent settlement that would transform that region. His warriors stopped being raiders and conquerors and became, in a sense, colonists. They took English wives, settled on English land, and began farming the fertile fields they had won with their swords. The other portion of the army, led by Guthrum, Ossitel, and Anwend, remained focused on the Midlands and would eventually turn their full attention back to the conquest of Wessex. That same year, they drove King Burh of Mercia into exile. Alfred's brother-in-law, married to his sister Ethelwith, fled rather than face capture and certain death, making his way to Rome, where he would die far from his kingdom. The Vikings placed a puppet named Ceolwulf II on the Mercian throne, extracting oaths and tribute while maintaining nominal English rule. During these years, while the Vikings were occupied elsewhere, Alfred did not sit idle. He used the breathing space to strengthen Wessex internally, to learn from his defeats, to prepare for the war he knew would eventually come. He studied the Vikings' tactics, analyzed what had worked against them and what had failed. He began to understand that the traditional Saxon approach to warfare, gathering the fyrd, the militia of free men, for short campaigns before sending them back to their farms, was inadequate against an enemy that could campaign year-round, that maintained permanent armies, that could outlast any force that needed to harvest crops or return home before winter. He began to conceive of reforms to the military system, though implementing them would require time and resources he did not yet possess. He strengthened relationships with his ealdormen, the nobles who governed regions of Wessex and commanded warriors in times of war, ensuring their loyalty and preparing them for the conflicts ahead. Alfred also sought alliances beyond Wessex's borders. The Welsh kingdoms to the west had their own conflicts with Vikings, their own reasons to oppose further conquests. Alfred cultivated relationships with Welsh rulers, offering them the possibility of English support against raiders in exchange for their promise not to aid the Vikings against Wessex. He maintained the Mercian connection through his wife's family and through his sister Ethelwith, though with Mercia under Viking dominance and ruled by a puppet king. The alliance was more symbolic than substantial. He even looked across the channel to Francia, where the descendants of Charlemagne faced their own Viking problems, and where Alfred's stepmother Judith still had connections, seeking any advantage that might help Wessex survive the storm he knew was coming. The peace, such as it was, could not last forever. By 875, the Vikings under Guthrum were moving again, and this time their attention was turning back toward the last independent English kingdom. In 876, they broke the peace Alfred had purchased 5 years earlier and advanced into Wessex, seizing the fortress at Wareham in Dorset. The location was strategic. Wareham sat on the coast, allowing the Vikings to be supplied by sea, while also serving as a base from which to raid deep into Wessex. Alfred responded with both military force and diplomacy, surrounding the fortress and negotiating another treaty. The Vikings swore oaths, sacred oaths, on what Asser described as a holy arm ring, that they would depart from Alfred's kingdom. They gave hostages as surety of their good faith, and then, in a pattern that was becoming grimly familiar, they broke their word. Under cover of night, the Vikings slipped away from Wareham, moving quickly westward to Exeter in Devon, occupying another coastal fortress before Alfred could respond. It seemed like a brilliant maneuver that would once again put the Vikings in an impregnable position from which they could dictate terms. But fate, or perhaps divine providence as the Christian chroniclers would have it, intervened. A large Viking fleet sailed from Wareham, perhaps carrying reinforcements or supplies meant to sustain the army at Exeter through a long siege. This fleet, supposedly consisting of 120 ships with crews numbering in the hundreds or even thousands, ran into a storm off the coast of Swanage. The storm was catastrophic. Ships were driven onto rocks, sank in the violent seas, or were smashed to pieces by waves. Asser and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle both recorded that the fleet was destroyed, and while the exact numbers may have been exaggerated in the telling, the loss was clearly devastating to the Viking cause. With their seaborne reinforcements destroyed and their position at Exeter suddenly much more precarious, the Vikings were forced to negotiate yet another treaty with Alfred. This time, exhausted perhaps by years of campaigning and sobered by their losses at sea, they actually kept their word, at least for a while. They withdrew from Exeter and moved east into Mercia, occupying Gloucester for the winter of 877-878. Alfred had won another reprieve, but it had cost him more treasure in tribute, and he knew with absolute certainty that this would not be the last time the Vikings came to Wessex. They were patient, they were persistent, and they would keep coming until either they conquered Wessex or Wessex found some way to stop them permanently. As 877 turned to 878, as winter settled over England and most armies retired to their halls to wait for spring, Alfred celebrated Christmas at Chippenham, a royal estate in Wiltshire. The court gathered there for the holy season, for feasting and religious observance, for a brief moment of peace and normalcy in a world that had known little of either for years. Ealhswith was there with their children. Nobles came to pay their respects to their king. Priests sang hymns in celebration of Christ's birth, and for a few precious days, Alfred could perhaps pretend that his kingdom was at peace. But beyond the warm halls of Chippenham, in the winter darkness, Guthrum and his Viking army were moving south, and they were coming for Alfred. The years between Alfred's accession in 871 and the crisis of 878 were marked not by grand victories or decisive battles, but by the grinding, exhausting work of keeping a kingdom alive when every instinct of the age suggested it should already be dead. These were years of compromise and calculation, of paying tribute that emptied treasuries and swallowing pride that tasted like poison. These were years when Alfred learned that kingship was not the glorious destiny poets sang about, but rather an endless series of impossible choices where every option led to suffering, and the only question was which path led to slightly less disaster. The payment of Danegeld, the silver tribute paid to Vikings in exchange for peace, was a practice that had become almost routine in England by Alfred's time. Previous kings had discovered that a few chests of silver could buy months or even years of peace, could send Viking armies off to plunder someone else's kingdom instead of yours. But the practice had insidious effects that went beyond the immediate financial burden. Every payment taught the Vikings that threatening England was profitable, that they could return again and again to the same source and be paid each time to leave. Every payment also depleted the resources needed to actually fight the Vikings, making future resistance more difficult, and every payment damaged the king's reputation, made him look weak before his own people, raised questions about whether he could actually protect his kingdom or merely postpone its destruction. Alfred paid the Danegeld multiple times because the alternative was immediate invasion by an army that had already conquered 3 kingdoms and had demonstrated repeatedly its ability to defeat English forces in open battle. He paid it in 871 after the Battle of Wilton, buying the peace that allowed him to consolidate his new reign. He paid it again in 876 to get the Vikings to leave Wareham, though they broke that agreement almost immediately. He paid it after Exeter, buying time for his kingdom to recover from years of crisis. Each payment was a calculated bet that the time and space purchased with silver would be worth more than the silver itself, that Wessex could use the breathing room to prepare for the next crisis, that somehow a solution would emerge from the temporary respite. But Alfred understood that silver alone would never save Wessex. The Vikings were not a problem that could be solved by diplomacy and tribute, because they were not a unified force with coherent goals that could be negotiated. They were multiple war bands with different leaders, different ambitions, different levels of honor regarding oaths and treaties. Peace made with one Viking leader meant nothing to another. An army bought off 1 year would be replaced by a different army the next year, or would simply return when they ran out of silver and wanted more. The fundamental problem was military. English armies, as currently organized and equipped, could not consistently defeat Viking armies of comparable size. Until that changed, no amount of silver would provide lasting security. The traditional English military system was based on the fard, a militia composed of free men who owed military service to their lord and ultimately to the king. When war threatened, the fard would be summoned. Men would leave their farms and workshops, gather their weapons and armor, and assemble at designated locations to form an army. This system had worked adequately for generations when warfare consisted of brief campaigns between neighboring kingdoms, raids that could be repelled in a few days or weeks before everyone went home to tend their crops. But it was hopelessly inadequate against an enemy like the Vikings, who maintained permanent armies, who could campaign year-round, who had no farms to return to because they lived off plunder and tribute. The fyrd had other problems beyond its temporary nature. Many of the men who answered the summons were poorly equipped, with weapons and armor they could barely afford, with minimal training beyond whatever their fathers had taught them. They were farmers and craftsmen first, warriors only when necessity demanded it, against Viking warriors who had been fighting since adolescence, who had survived battles across multiple kingdoms, who fought with professional skill and savage determination. The fyrd was often outmatched. Even when English armies had numerical superiority, which was not always the case, the quality gap could be decisive in the chaos of battle. Alfred could not completely overhaul the military system. Not yet. Not while fighting for survival. Not while lacking the resources and authority such reforms would require. But he could learn, could study what worked and what failed, could begin to understand what changes would be necessary. He observed that the Vikings' greatest advantage beyond their fighting skill was their mobility. They moved quickly, struck unexpectedly, and retreated before effective resistance could be organized. They used horses to move overland and ships to move along rivers and coasts, giving them strategic mobility that allowed them to choose when and where to fight. They fortified positions quickly and effectively, using temporary defenses to protect themselves while they raided the surrounding countryside, then abandoning those positions and moving on before they could be effectively besieged. The Vikings also understood logistics in ways that English forces sometimes did not. They knew how to supply their armies from the land, how to keep their forces fed and equipped even when far from their bases. They established supply chains, built fortified camps that served as distribution points for food and weapons, and organized their forces with a level of professional efficiency that spoke to years of experience. English armies, by contrast, often struggled with supply problems. The fyrd expected to return home within weeks and brought limited supplies, and commanders sometimes found their armies melting away not because of defeat in battle, but because men ran out of food or needed to return to their farms for harvest. Alfred began to conceive of what would later become his most significant military reforms, though implementing them would have to wait for more stable times. He understood that Wessex needed a standing army, or at least the core of one. Professional warriors who could respond immediately to threats without waiting for the fyrd to be summoned and assembled. He understood that defense needed to be organized around fortified positions, permanent strongholds that could protect populations and serve as bases for counterattacks. He understood that mobility was crucial, that forces needed to be able to move as quickly as the Vikings to counter their raids, and he understood that England needed a navy, ships that could intercept Viking fleets at sea, or at least contest their control of rivers and coasts. But understanding what needed to be done, and having the resources and authority to do it, were different things. In the years from 871 to 878, Alfred was barely holding his kingdom together, struggling to maintain enough strength to discourage Viking attacks while lacking the power to drive them out entirely. His position was made more difficult by the example of what had happened to other kingdoms. Northumbria had resisted and been conquered. East Anglia had resisted and been conquered. Mercia had resisted and been reduced to a puppet state. The lesson seemed clear. Resistance led to destruction. Perhaps some of Alfred's nobles must have whispered it would be better to negotiate, to accept Viking overlordship, to keep their lands and lives even if it meant bending the knee to pagan conquerors. Alfred faced this defeatism not just among the common people, but among the nobles whose support he needed. Some ealdormen, looking at the long odds and the pattern of defeat, began to hedge their bets. They paid their taxes to Alfred and gave him their oaths, but they also made quiet contact with Viking leaders, ensuring that whichever side ultimately won, they would be positioned to survive. This pragmatism was understandable given the circumstances, but it weakened Alfred's position by making his supporters unreliable. When he needed to know whether his forces would fight or whether some nobles might switch sides at a crucial moment, he could never be entirely certain. Trust became a luxury in a world where survival required constant calculation of advantage. Alfred also had to manage the relationship with what remained of Mercia. His sister Ethelwith was married to King Burgred, but when Burgred was driven into exile in 874, that connection became more complicated. The Vikings placed Ceolwulf II on the Mercian throne, and while Ceolwulf was clearly their puppet, he was also the de facto ruler of whatever parts of Mercia the Vikings allowed to retain English governance. Alfred had to decide whether to recognize Ceolwulf as a legitimate king, whether to maintain relations with him, or whether to treat him as an enemy collaborator. The choice was not simple. Maintaining connections with Mercia, even Viking-dominated Mercia, could provide intelligence and influence, but treating with Ceolwulf risked legitimizing Viking conquests and demoralizing Alfred's own supporters, who wanted to believe that resistance was still possible. The coinage of the period provides fascinating evidence of the complex political situation. Alfred and Ceolwulf II at some point issued joint coinage, coins that bore both their names and suggested some form of cooperation, or at least mutual recognition. Some of these coins styled Alfred as Rex Anglorum, King of the English, rather than just King of Wessex, a remarkable claim given that he controlled only one of England's kingdoms. But the claim reflected Alfred's vision of what he hoped to achieve, a unified England under Saxon, rather than Viking rule. Whether Ceolwulf agreed to this ambitious title, or whether it was simply Alfred's aspiration is unclear, but the coins demonstrate that Alfred was thinking beyond mere survival, was imagining a future where the Viking conquest might be reversed. During these years, Alfred's family grew. Aelswith bore more children, another son named Ethelwerd, and another daughter, Elfrith. Each child was precious not just personally, but politically, representing future alliances that could be forged through strategic marriages. Alfred took his children's education seriously in ways that reflected his own frustrated love of learning. He ensured they were taught to read, both in English and in Latin, for those destined for religious vocations. His daughters were educated as thoroughly as his sons, an unusual practice for the time that reflected Alfred's belief that learning was valuable for its own sake, not just as preparation for specific roles. Young Edward, as heir to the throne, received special attention, training in both martial skills and in the principles of governance that he would one day need. Alfred's court during these years was necessarily modest. The treasuries were depleted by tribute payments and military expenses. The grand ceremonies and lavish feasts that characterized peacetime courts had to be scaled back. But Alfred maintained certain standards, certain practices that demonstrated Wessex remained a kingdom worth defending. He held court, heard petitions, dispensed justice, maintained the rituals of kingship, even when those rituals might have seemed like empty gestures given the desperate circumstances. He understood that a king's authority rested not just on military power, but on perception, on the belief among his people that he was their rightful ruler, chosen by God and worthy of their loyalty. Every public appearance, every judgment rendered, every ceremony performed reinforced that authority and gave his people reason to believe that Wessex would endure. The Church played a crucial role in maintaining morale and legitimacy during these dark years. The Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops provided spiritual guidance and political support, reminding the people that they fought not just for land and power, but for Christian civilization itself against pagan invaders. The Vikings' reputation for destroying churches and monasteries, for desecrating holy places and slaughtering monks, made the war seem like a religious struggle as well as a political one. Alfred, genuinely pious in his beliefs, found strength in his faith and encouraged others to do the same. If God willed it, Wessex would survive. If God willed it, the pagans would be defeated. And if God was testing the English through their suffering, then they must endure that test with patience and courage. But by late 877, as another winter approached and the Vikings had withdrawn from Exeter into Mercia, Alfred must have known that the testing was far from over. The pattern was too clear, the Viking appetite for conquest too obvious. They would come again, and when they came, they would likely come with everything they had, determined to finish what they had started 8 years earlier when the Great Heathen Army first landed in East Anglia. Alfred had survived longer than the other English kingdoms, had proven more resilient and resourceful than the Vikings probably expected. But survival was not victory, and time was running out. The question was not whether the final confrontation would come, but when, and whether Alfred would be ready when it did. The attack came on Twelfth Night, January 6th, 878, the culmination of the Christmas season, when Alfred's court was celebrating the last of the holy days at Chippenham. The royal estate should have been safe. It was deep in Wessex, fortified to some degree, garrisoned with the king's household warriors. More importantly, it was winter, the season when warfare traditionally ceased, when even the Vikings typically remained in their camps rather than launching major campaigns. The rules of war, such as they were, suggested that Alfred and his court could celebrate Christmas without fear of attack. Guthrum, the Viking leader, understood that Alfred would think this way, understood that the element of surprise could be worth more than any number of additional warriors. And so, on the night when Christ's incarnation was being celebrated with feasting and song, when defenses were relaxed and warriors were perhaps drunk on ale and confidence, Guthrum struck. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Viking warriors poured into Chippenham, their presence announced by screams and the clash of weapons before most of the defenders fully understood what was happening. In the chaos and darkness, with attackers already inside the defenses and enemies impossible to distinguish from friends in the confusion, organized resistance was nearly impossible. Alfred's household warriors fought desperately to protect their king, to buy time for escape, and their sacrifice saved his life. With Aelswith and his children, with whatever loyal followers could be gathered in those frantic moments, Alfred fled into the winter night, leaving behind his court, his treasure, his dignity, and his kingdom. The flight from Chippenham was a nightmare journey through frozen fields and dark forests, with every shadow potentially hiding pursuers, with cold that bit through inadequate clothing and exhaustion that made every step torture. Alfred, who weeks before had been a king ruling from his halls and dispensing justice from his throne, was now a fugitive running for his life with his family and a handful of followers. The psychological shock must have been nearly as devastating as the physical danger. In one night, everything had been stripped away, the trappings of kingship, the security of his position, the confidence that had sustained him through years of struggle. The Vikings had done in hours what years of warfare had failed to accomplish. They had driven him from his kingdom and left him with nothing but his life and the loyalty of those few who had escaped with him. Alfred made for the Somerset Marshes, that trackless wilderness of waterways and islands where a man could hide if he knew the terrain and could endure the harsh conditions. The area around Athelney, a small island of solid ground surrounded by water and swamp, became his refuge. The name Athelney came from the Old English Ethelinghaig, meaning Prince's Island or Island of Princes, and now it truly earned that name as it sheltered the last free English king. The conditions were appalling even by the standards of that harsh age. Winter in the marshes meant cold so intense that water froze, meant dampness that seeped into bones and bred sickness, meant hunger when the land yielded little food, and supply lines were non-existent. The royal family, accustomed to warm halls and regular meals, now lived in crude shelters, eating whatever could be hunted or foraged, surviving day to day with no certainty that tomorrow would come. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled later during Alfred's reign, and naturally sympathetic to its royal patron, tried to maintain some dignity in describing this period. Alfred was not hiding in defeat, but strategically repositioning, not fleeing from enemies, but preparing for counterattack. But the reality must have been far grimmer than the official chronicle suggested. For several months, from January through March or April of 878, Alfred essentially disappeared from English history. His kingdom thought him dead or fled overseas. His enemies believed Wessex was finally conquered, and his followers scattered to save themselves. Some English nobles, looking at the situation pragmatically, submitted to Guthrum and accepted Viking overlordship. Others fled to the continent, following the example of Burh of Mercia in seeking safety in exile. The kingdom that Alfred had struggled to maintain for 7 years was falling apart without him there to hold it together. It was during this period, according to legend, that the most famous story about Alfred took place, the tale of the burned cakes. As the story was told generations later, Alfred, in his disguise, sought shelter in the humble home of a peasant woman, a cowherd's or swineherd's wife, who did not recognize the bedraggled fugitive as her king. She was baking bread, small loaves or cakes cooked on a griddle by the fire, and she asked Alfred to watch them while she attended to other chores. But Alfred, consumed by worry about his kingdom, distracted by plans and fears and the weight of his failures, paid no attention to the baking bread. The cakes burned, filling the hut with smoke and the smell of scorched dough, and when the woman returned, she scolded him furiously. Here he sat, warming himself at her fire and eating her food, and he couldn't even be bothered to turn a few cakes so they wouldn't burn. The story, with its image of a king humbled and brought low, taking rebuke from a peasant woman who had no idea she was berating her sovereign, has persisted for over 1,000 years because it speaks to something appealing about Alfred's character, his humility, his humanity, his willingness to endure hardship without complaint. But the story first appeared in writing only in the late 10th century, nearly 100 years after Alfred's death, in a text called The Life of St. Neot. It was likely a legend, a tale crafted to illustrate a moral point about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects, or perhaps about how even kings must submit to God's will and accept humiliation. Whether it actually happened in that hut on Athelney is impossible to know. But true or not, the story captured something real about that terrible winter. Alfred brought low, reduced to dependence on the charity of common people, stripped of everything that had made him a king, except the will to reclaim what he had lost. But Alfred, even in his darkest hour, was not broken. The weeks and months at Athelney were not spent in despair, but in preparation. He had escaped with some of his most loyal followers, including Ealdorman Athelney of Somerset, who brought not just his own loyalty, but knowledge of the local terrain and connections with the people of the region. These Somerset men became the core of Alfred's resistance movement, and their local knowledge proved invaluable. They knew the paths through the marshes, knew which areas could support hidden camps, knew how to move unseen through territory that appeared impassable to outsiders. The marshes that seemed like a prison to the Vikings were actually a fortress to those who understood them. Alfred established something more than a mere hiding place at Athelney. He built a fortification, using whatever materials were at hand and whatever labor his followers could provide. The site had been used before, perhaps as an Iron Age fort, and there were existing defenses that could be reinforced. Through the winter and into early spring, even as the rest of Wessex lay under Viking control, Alfred's men built walls, dug ditches, created a stronghold from which they could launch raids. It was guerrilla warfare of the most basic kind. Strike quickly from hiding, inflict casualties, seize supplies, and retreat before the enemy could respond in force. The Vikings, occupying the towns and major estates of Wessex, found themselves under constant harassment from an enemy that refused to stand and fight, but inflicted steady losses nonetheless. Alfred's resistance had effects beyond the immediate tactical impact of the raids. Every attack demonstrated that he was still alive, still fighting, still defying the Viking conquest. News spread through Somerset, then to other parts of Wessex. The king had not fled, had not surrendered, had not abandoned his people. Men who had been on the verge of submission to the Vikings began to reconsider. If Alfred still fought, perhaps resistance was still possible. If the king had not given up, perhaps they shouldn't either. The psychological impact of Alfred's continued resistance, of his refusal to accept defeat even when reduced to hiding in marshes and raiding like a common outlaw, began to shift the mood in Wessex from despair to cautious hope. The Vikings, meanwhile, were discovering that conquering Wessex was easier than holding it. Guthrum had seized the major population centres, had driven Alfred into exile, had received the submission of many English nobles. By any conventional measure, he had won. But the victory felt incomplete because Alfred was still out there, still dangerous, still gathering support. And more troubling still, Guthrum's own forces were finding that occupation was costly. They had to garrison multiple locations, had to protect supply lines against raids, had to maintain forces in readiness against an enemy whose location and strength were uncertain. The clean conquest that had seemed within grasp in January was by March or April looking more like a grinding occupation with no clear end. A second Viking force landed in Devon on the northern coast, either as reinforcements for Guthrum or as an independent war band seeking to exploit Wessex's weakness. This was led by a chieftain named Burh, one of the original leaders of the Great Heathen Army, and supposedly another son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. If this second army had managed to coordinate with Guthrum, Alfred would have been caught between two forces with no possibility of escape. But the men of Devon, perhaps inspired by news of Alfred's continued resistance, gathered under their local leaders and confronted Burh at a place called Sinwit. The battle was fierce, but the Devon forces won, killing Burh and scattering his army. It was the first real English victory since the crisis began, and it meant that Alfred would not face enemies from two directions. As winter turned to spring and the days grew longer and warmer, Alfred began to plan something more ambitious than raids, a counterattack, a gamble that would either restore his kingdom or end in final defeat. He sent out messengers, quietly and carefully, to the ealdormen and thegns who had remained loyal, or who might be convinced to rise again. The message was simple: gather your forces, prepare for war, and wait for the signal. The king lived. The king would fight, and the king would give them one chance to reclaim their freedom or die in the attempt. Everything Alfred had learned in 7 years of warfare, all the bitter lessons of defeat and survival, all the understanding he had gained about Viking tactics and English weaknesses, would be tested in the coming weeks. Either his gamble would succeed and Wessex would survive, or it would fail, and England would become Danish from coast to coast, with only fading memories of the Saxon kingdoms that had once ruled this land. The fortress at Athelney, crude as it must have been, became the headquarters of what might be called the first organized English resistance movement against Viking occupation. Alfred transformed his refuge from a hiding place into a base of operations, and in doing so, he demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond the conventional warfare of his age. He could not match Guthrum's forces in open battle. Not yet, not with only the scattered followers who had joined him in the marshes, but he could make the Viking occupation so costly, so dangerous, so exhausting, that Guthrum's forces would be worn down and demoralized while Alfred's strength grew. The guerrilla tactics Alfred employed were not entirely novel. Smaller forces had always used hidden-run raids when facing superior enemies, but Alfred brought systematic organization to what might otherwise have been random attacks by desperate men. He gathered intelligence about Viking movements, learning which estates they had occupied, which roads they used for supply, which commanders were most vulnerable to surprise attacks. The local population, even those who had formerly submitted to Viking rule, often provided information. A farmer who bent his knee to the Vikings during the day might send word to Athelney at night about where the enemy had camped, or how many warriors guarded a particular location. The occupied people of Wessex might have lacked the means to resist openly, but they could aid their king in small ways that collectively made the difference between success and failure for Alfred's raids. Each raid was carefully planned despite the need for speed and surprise. Alfred's men would emerge from the marshes, move quickly to their target, strike hard and fast, and retreat before Viking reinforcements could arrive. They targeted supply convoys especially, knowing that every wagon of food or weapons they seized was one less resource available to Guthrum's army. They attacked small garrisons, places where the Vikings had left only a handful of warriors to hold an estate or control a village. They ambushed patrols, picking off isolated groups of Vikings who wandered too far from support. Each attack was small in scale, killed only a few enemies, gained only limited supplies. But dozens of such attacks over weeks and months added up to significant losses for the Vikings and significant gains for Alfred. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical attacks. Every time Alfred's forces struck and escaped, they demonstrated that the Vikings were not invincible, that they could not control all of Wessex despite their apparent victory, that resistance was still possible. Vikings guarding an estate would go to sleep each night, wondering if this would be the night the shadows came alive with English warriors seeking revenge. Supply convoys would travel warily, never certain that the empty road ahead didn't hide an ambush. The Vikings could not be everywhere at once, could not guard everything simultaneously, and Alfred exploited that fundamental limitation of occupation forces. The cost to Viking morale was difficult to measure, but undoubtedly real. Soldiers far from home, occupying hostile territory, facing an enemy who would not stand and fight, but who struck without warning and vanished before they could be caught, began to lose the confidence that had carried them through years of successful conquest. Alfred also used this time to rebuild his army, slowly and carefully gathering strength for the decisive battle he knew must eventually come. Men who had fled to the marshes when Chippenham fell, men who had gone into hiding in other parts of Wessex, men who had submitted to the Vikings but never accepted defeat in their hearts. These began making their way to Athelney. Some came alone, slipping through Viking patrols at night to join their king. Others came in small groups, warriors who had banded together and fought their own small campaigns before learning that Alfred still lived and led the resistance. Each new arrival brought not just another sword arm, but also information, news from other parts of Wessex, intelligence about Viking dispositions and English sentiment. The logistics of maintaining even a small army in the marshes must have been challenging. Food was scarce. What the land provided naturally, what could be taken in raids, what sympathetic locals could smuggle past Viking checkpoints. Weapons and armor required maintenance, but smiths and tools were in short supply. Medical care for the wounded was primitive at best, and men died from infected wounds or illnesses that might have been treatable with proper facilities. The living conditions remained harsh even as spring brought warmer weather, because the marshes were fundamentally unsuited to supporting large groups of people. Yet Alfred held his force together through the force of his personality, through his willingness to share in the hardships rather than demand, privilege, through the vision he articulated of what they were fighting for. That vision went beyond merely surviving or even winning battles. Alfred spoke to his followers about England itself, about Saxon Christian civilization threatened by pagan conquerors, about the duty they owed to their ancestors who had built this land and their descendants who would inherit it. He framed the struggle in terms that gave it meaning beyond personal survival or political power. They were not just fighting for Alfred or even for Wessex. They were fighting for a way of life, for the faith that defined them, for the right to live free under their own laws, rather than as conquered subjects of foreign invaders. This vision, articulated in quiet conversations around campfires and in brief speeches before raids, helped men endure the hardships and risks of guerrilla warfare. Ealdorman Athelney of Somerset deserves special recognition for his role during this period. As the senior noble who had remained with Alfred from the beginning, he provided not just military support, but also political legitimacy. His presence confirmed that this was not just a band of outlaws, but the court of the legitimate king, that the resistance was authorized and righteous rather than mere banditry. Athelney's knowledge of Somerset and his relationships with local thegns and freemen provided the network that made Alfred's guerrilla campaign possible. Without someone like Athelney, who could bridge the gap between the king and the local population, Alfred might have remained isolated and ineffective in his marsh fortress. The spiritual dimension of the resistance also mattered greatly. Priests and monks who had fled the Vikings, or who moved secretly through occupied territory, came to Athelney to provide religious services. The celebration of Mass, the observance of holy days, the maintenance of Christian ritual even in the depths of the marshes. All of this reinforced the sense that God had not abandoned Wessex, that the struggle against the pagans was holy as well as political. Alfred himself, deeply pious despite his circumstances, found strength in prayer and religious observance. He may have wondered sometimes if God was punishing him for some failing, may have questioned why Providence allowed the pagans to prosper while the Christian kingdom suffered. But he never lost faith that ultimately God would deliver victory if the English remained worthy of it. By April or early May of 878, Alfred judged that the time had come to move from guerrilla warfare to conventional battle. His force at Athelney had grown to perhaps a few hundred warriors, experienced men who had proven their courage and loyalty through months of hardship. But a few hundred would not be enough to face Guthrum's army, which numbered in the thousands. Alfred needed to summon the Fyrd, needed to gather the militia of Somerset, Wiltshire, and the other parts of Wessex that remained loyal. The question was whether they would come, whether the men of Wessex still had the will to fight after the disasters of January, whether Alfred's continued resistance had inspired them, or whether they saw him as a lost cause clinging to a kingdom that was already gone. The signal went out. Messengers riding from Athelney to designated meeting places throughout southwestern Wessex, carrying Alfred's call to arms. The king lived and would fight. The time had come to reclaim the kingdom or die in the attempt. Every man who could carry a weapon was summoned to gather at Egbert Stone, a location somewhere east of the great forest of Selwood, on a specific date in May. This was not a request, but a royal command, and it would test whether Alfred still commanded the loyalty of his kingdom. If the men came, if the Fyrd assembled as summoned, then there was hope. If they did not come, if the call went unanswered or brought only disappointing numbers, then Alfred would know that his kingdom had truly fallen, and that no amount of courage or determination could resurrect it. The days before the appointed gathering must have been agonizing for Alfred. He had staked everything on this gamble, had emerged from hiding to issue a challenge to Guthrum that he could only back up if his people rallied to him. He waited at Athelney, trying to project confidence while privately wondering if he had miscalculated, if the months of occupation had broken his people's will, if the sacrifice and suffering would all be for nothing because too few would answer his call. Scouts brought reports of movement throughout Wessex, men gathering weapons, groups forming and moving toward Egbert Stone, but the reports were fragmentary and uncertain. Impossible to know if they represented a handful of loyal followers or the mass mobilization Alfred needed. When Alfred finally left Athelney to ride to Egbert Stone for the appointed gathering, he must have carried with him both hope and dread. The journey from the Marshes across the intervening territory was itself dangerous, moving through areas where Viking patrols might be encountered at any moment. But Alfred had to go, had to see with his own eyes whether his kingdom would stand with him. The fate of England would be decided not in that moment, but in the hearts of the common men of Wessex, who had to choose between the safety of submission and the danger of resistance. If they chose resistance, if they came when their king called them, then the Battle of Edington would happen and Wessex would have a chance. If they did not come, then Alfred's story would end not with glory, but with a quiet disappearance into history. Just another failed king of a failed kingdom. Egbert Stone, named for Alfred's grandfather, who had briefly united much of England under his rule decades earlier, stood somewhere east of the ancient forest of Selwood, a landmark known to every man of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Western Hampshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that the meeting took place in the 7th week after Easter, sometime between May 4th and May 10th, 878, during the holy season of Whitsuntide, when Christians celebrated the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. For Alfred and his followers, the timing must have seemed providential. They too would need divine inspiration if they were to succeed against the odds they faced. Alfred arrived at Egbert Stone with his force from Athelney, perhaps a few hundred battle-hardened warriors who had survived the months in the marshes. He waited to see who would answer his summons, whether his kingdom still believed in him. And then they came. The Chronicle recorded it simply, but with evident emotion. All the people of Somerset and of Wiltshire and of that part of Hampshire which is on this side of the sea, and they rejoiced to see him. Thousands of men, farmers and craftsmen, who had left their homes and families, who had gathered their weapons and armor, who had risked Viking patrols to make the journey, assembled at Egbert Stone to follow their king into battle. The reunion must have been emotional beyond what any chronicle could capture. For 4 months, these people had believed their king was dead or fled, had lived under Viking occupation, had wondered if Wessex was lost forever. Now here was Alfred, alive and defiant, calling them to reclaim their freedom. And they had come, had left safety and security behind to bet everything on one desperate battle. The rejoicing the chronicle mentioned was probably inadequate to describe the scene. Warriors greeting comrades they thought dead, nobles reuniting with their king, common men seeing with their own eyes that resistance was still possible. Hope, that most dangerous and necessary of emotions, swept through the gathered host. But hope alone would not win battles. Alfred had to organize this army, had to turn a gathering of enthusiastic but largely untrained militia into a force that could face and defeat Guthrum's professional warriors. The exact size of the army assembled at Egbert Stone is unknown. Medieval chroniclers rarely provided accurate troop counts, and numbers were often exaggerated. Modern historians estimate that Alfred may have had somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 men, probably closer to the lower end of that range. Against him would be Guthrum's army, likely somewhat smaller than when it first invaded Wessex, but still formidable, composed of veterans who had conquered 3 kingdoms and expected to conquer a 4th. From Egbert Stone, the army marched to a place the chronicle called Ely, possibly near the modern village of Eastleigh Wood, or perhaps elsewhere in the vicinity. The exact location has been lost to time, like so many details of this crucial campaign. They spent a night there, and one imagines Alfred used that time to organize his forces, to arrange the shield wall that would be crucial in the coming battle, to speak to his commanders about the tactics they would employ. Medieval battles were often decided as much by morale and organization as by numbers or tactics, and Alfred needed his men to believe they could win. The next day, the army marched toward Edington, or Ethendon, as it was called in Old English, a location in Wiltshire near the modern town of Westbury. The Vikings had established a base at Chippenham, and Alfred's move toward Edington was either to intercept Guthrum's forces or to threaten Chippenham itself, forcing the Vikings to come out and fight. The strategic details are unclear from the surviving sources, but the result was what Alfred needed: a pitched battle where the 2 armies would face each other in the open, where courage and skill rather than fortifications and siege warfare would determine the outcome. The Battle of Edington was fought sometime in mid-May 878, probably between May 6th and May 12th. The armies met on ground that has been debated by historians ever since. Was it near Edington in Wiltshire, or at a different location in Somerset, or somewhere else entirely? The exact spot matters less than what happened there. The 2 shield walls formed up facing each other, Vikings on one side, Saxons on the other, and between them the space that would soon be filled with the dead and dying. This was warfare at its most brutal and primitive. 2 massed formations of men armed with swords, spears, and axes, protected by wooden shields and whatever armor they could afford, advancing toward each other until the lines collided and individual skill and collective determination decided who would stand and who would fall. Asser's description of the battle, written years later, but presumably based on accounts from those who fought there, captures some of the ferocity. Alfred attacked the whole pagan army fighting ferociously in dense order, and by divine will eventually won the victory, made great slaughter among them, and pursued them to their fortress. The phrase, fighting ferociously in dense order, suggests the nature of shield wall combat, not individual duels like romantic legends portray, but a grinding press of men shoving against each other, stabbing over and under shields, trying to create gaps in the enemy line, while preventing gaps in their own. The noise alone must have been overwhelming. the crash of weapons on shields, the screams of wounded men, the shouted encouragements and curses, all blending into a roar that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The battle hung in the balance for hours. Neither shield wall broke easily. These were experienced warriors on both sides, who understood that breaking formation meant death. But gradually, incrementally, the Saxons began to gain advantage. Perhaps it was Alfred's leadership, his personal example inspiring his men to fight beyond exhaustion. Perhaps it was desperation, the knowledge that defeat meant the end of English independence. Perhaps it was simply that, on this day, in this place, the Saxon warriors fought with more determination than their enemies. The Viking shield wall began to waver, then crack, then break. Once the formation collapsed, the battle turned into a rout. Vikings fleeing toward Chippenham with Saxon warriors in pursuit, cutting down those too slow to escape, taking revenge for months of occupation and suffering. The chronicle's statement that Alfred made great slaughter among them should not be taken as mere boasting. In the aftermath of a decisive battle when one side broke and fled, the casualties among the losing side could be catastrophic. Fleeing soldiers threw away weapons and shields to run faster, making them easy targets for pursuers. Exhausted men stumbled and fell, were overtaken and killed. Small groups that tried to stand and fight were overwhelmed by superior numbers. The Vikings who made it to Chippenham were the fortunate ones. Many of their comrades lay dead or dying on the road between Edington and their fortress, their blood soaking into the English soil they had tried to conquer. But the battle itself was not the end. Chippenham remained in Viking hands, and as long as Guthrum held that fortress, the war continued. Alfred did not make the mistake of assuming victory was complete. He moved his army quickly to besiege Chippenham, surrounding it before the Vikings could recover from their defeat or receive reinforcements. The siege was not a prolonged affair requiring complex siege engines or starving the defenders into submission. Alfred had neither the time nor the resources for such a siege. Instead, he maintained pressure, preventing the Vikings from escaping or resupplying, while negotiating with Guthrum about the terms of surrender. After 14 days, according to Asser, the Vikings were brought to the extreme depths of despair by hunger, cold, and fear, and sought peace. This suggests conditions inside Chippenham were grim: food running low, water possibly contaminated, disease spreading among wounded men, and the knowledge that Alfred's army outside would give no quarter if they attempted to break out. Guthrum, facing the destruction of his army and possibly his own death, agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable before Edington. He would leave Wessex. He would not return to make war on Alfred, and most remarkably, most unprecedented in the history of Viking English conflicts, he would be baptized as a Christian. The demand for baptism was a stroke of political and religious genius on Alfred's part. It was not enough to defeat Guthrum militarily. Alfred needed to transform the relationship between them, needed to create bonds that would make future conflict less likely. By becoming Guthrum's godfather through the baptism ceremony, Alfred would create a spiritual kinship that both men would be expected to honor. By bringing Guthrum into the Christian community, Alfred was attempting to civilize his enemy, to give him stakes in maintaining peace beyond mere military calculation. It was an ambitious gamble, asking a pagan warrior to renounce the gods his ancestors had worshipped for the god of the people he had just tried to conquer. But Guthrum, perhaps seeing no alternative, agreed. 3 weeks after the Battle of Edington, Guthrum and 30 of his most important chieftains rode to Aller, near Athelney, symbolically coming to Alfred's refuge, acknowledging by the choice of location who had won this war. There, in a small church that must have seemed impossibly humble for such a momentous ceremony, Guthrum was baptized. Alfred stood as his godfather. a role that in medieval Christian understanding created a bond nearly as close as blood kinship. The Viking warlord who had driven Alfred into the Marshes, who had conquered most of Wessex, who had come so close to ending English independence forever, took a new name, Athelstan, a good Saxon name that meant noble stone, suggesting permanence and reliability. For 8 days afterward, part of the traditional ritual following baptism, Guthrum remained with Alfred, and the former enemies engaged in the ceremonies that marked the creation of a new relationship. Then came a feast at Wedmore, near Cheddar in Somerset, that lasted 12 days according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This was not just celebration, but diplomacy, the sealing of the peace through the shared consumption of food and drink, through the exchange of gifts that created obligations of honor. Alfred honored Guthrum and his chieftains, gave them rich presents, treated them not as defeated enemies, but as guests deserving of respect. The message was clear. This peace was not built solely on military victory, but on mutual respect, on the transformation of enemies into something approaching friends, or at least into people who could coexist without constant warfare. The terms of what became known as the Treaty of Wedmore, while not recorded in detail in contemporary sources, can be reconstructed from later events. Guthrum and his army would leave Wessex and return to East Anglia, the kingdom they had conquered a decade earlier. They would not make war on Alfred or Wessex again. The baptism and the peace were connected. Guthrum's conversion to Christianity made him, in theory at least, Alfred's brother in faith as well as his godson, creating multiple layers of obligation and relationship that would discourage future conflict. Whether Guthrum's conversion was sincere or purely political is impossible to know, but he kept the peace for the rest of his life, which suggests the ceremony meant something to him beyond mere expedience. During the summer of 878, Guthrum's army remained at Chippenham, presumably resting and reorganizing after their defeat. Then, as agreed, they departed Wessex, moving first to Cirencester in Mercia, before eventually settling in East Anglia. The Viking threat to Wessex had not been eliminated. Other Viking armies still existed. Other ambitious warlords still eyed England's wealth. But the immediate crisis was over. The Battle of Edington and its aftermath had accomplished what no other English kingdom had managed. Wessex had survived the Viking onslaught, had defeated the Great Heathen Army in battle, and had forced its enemies to terms. Alfred had saved his kingdom against odds that would have seemed insurmountable just months earlier. The king, who had hidden in the marshes, who had been reduced to guerrilla warfare, who had gambled everything on one desperate battle, had won. England had been saved, or at least one part of England had been saved, and that survival would prove to be the seed from which a unified English nation would eventually grow. The relationship between Alfred and Guthrum, after the Treaty of Wedmore, was remarkable for its time. Two men who had tried to kill each other, who had led armies that slaughtered each other's warriors, now bound together by Christian baptism and political necessity. The transformation of Guthrum from pagan conqueror to Christian godson of Alfred was not just a political ceremony, but represented a fundamental shift in how the Viking invasions would be understood going forward. These were no longer simply raids by heathens who could never be part of Christian English society. They were, or at least could become, neighbours who happened to have arrived by conquest rather than inheritance. Guthrum's baptism at Aller was performed with all the solemnity that the occasion demanded. The ceremony itself would have followed the traditional liturgy. Questions about faith, renunciation of the devil and all his works, immersion in or anointing with holy water, the bestowal of white baptismal garments, the anointing with chrism oil. Alfred, standing as godfather, would have participated in the ritual, placing his hands on Guthrum's head or shoulders. speaking the words that confirmed the spiritual relationship being created. The 30 Viking chieftains, who were baptized alongside their leader, would have gone through similar ceremonies, though probably with other nobles of Alfred's court serving as their godfathers, creating a web of spiritual kinship between the Saxons and Vikings. The choice of the name Athelstan for Guthrum was itself significant. In Saxon naming traditions, names often carried meanings related to virtue, nobility, or strength. Athelstan, noble stone, suggested permanence, reliability, steadfastness. It was a name that implied Guthrum would be as solid and dependable as stone in keeping his oaths. Whether this was aspirational, a hope for what Guthrum would become, or whether Alfred genuinely believed his former enemy had been transformed by baptism, the name represented a vision of what the relationship could be. No longer would Guthrum be simply the Viking warlord or the pagan enemy. He would be Athelstan, a man with a Christian name and Christian obligations. The 8 days that Guthrum and his chieftains spent with Alfred after the baptism were part of the traditional observance following the ceremony. In those days, newly baptized Christians would wear special white garments to symbolize their purification, and there would be additional instruction in Christian teachings and practices. One imagines long conversations between Alfred and Guthrum during this period, about faith, certainly, but also about the practical business of maintaining peace, about the boundaries between their territories, about how to manage the inevitable frictions that would arise when Saxons and Vikings lived in close proximity. These conversations laid the groundwork for the more formal treaty that would eventually be written down and become known to history. The 12 days of feasting at Wedmore that followed were both celebration and diplomacy. In medieval culture, sharing food created bonds of fellowship and obligation. To eat at someone's table made you, in a sense, part of their household, created expectations of mutual loyalty and respect. Alfred, by hosting Guthrum and his chieftains, was not just celebrating the peace, but actively creating the social and psychological conditions that would make the peace durable. The Vikings were honored with gifts: gold, silver, fine weapons, rich cloth, whatever treasures Wessex could provide, despite the depleted state of its treasury. These gifts were not just bribery, but demonstrations of Alfred's power and wealth, proof that he was a worthy ally and a dangerous enemy, someone whose friendship was valuable and whose enmity was best avoided. The Wedmore Agreement, as it came to be known, was primarily concerned with immediate practical matters, getting Guthrum's army out of Wessex and establishing that there would be no more hostilities. The more detailed and comprehensive treaty of Alfred and Guthrum would not be finalized for several years, probably not until 886, when Alfred captured London and needed to formalize the boundaries between English and Danish territories. But the Wedmore Agreement established the principles that would govern that later treaty. Wessex was Alfred's, East Anglia would be Guthrum's, and neither would make war on the other. It was a partition of England, formalizing the reality that the Vikings had conquered and settled large parts of the country, and that those conquests could not be easily reversed. The establishment of what would become known as the Danelaw, the territories under Danish law and Danish control, was a bitter pill for Alfred and his supporters to swallow. It meant acknowledging that 3 of England's 4 great kingdoms were lost, that Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia were now Viking territories where Danish customs and laws would prevail. English people living in those areas would be subject to Danish rule, would pay taxes to Danish lords, would see their churches and monasteries disrupted or destroyed. For Alfred, who had fought to preserve English independence and Christian civilization, accepting that large parts of England were now permanently Danish must have been painful, but the alternative to accepting the Danelaw was continued warfare with uncertain prospects of success. Wessex had won one battle, had forced one Viking army to leave, but other Viking forces remained. Guthrum's army, though defeated at Edington, was not destroyed. It had retreated in order and remained a potent military force. If Alfred had demanded too much, had tried to push Guthrum out of England entirely, the war would have continued and might have ended differently. By accepting the partition, Alfred gained time and space to rebuild Wessex, to implement the reforms he knew were necessary, to prepare for future conflicts. It was a strategic compromise that sacrificed some English territory to secure the survival of the rest. Guthrum, for his part, seems to have taken his baptism seriously, or at least took seriously the obligations it created. For the remaining 12 years of his life he ruled East Anglia as a Christian king, maintained peace with Wessex, and even cooperated with Alfred on occasion when their mutual interest aligned. He issued coins bearing his baptismal name Athelstan rather than his birth name Guthrum, suggesting that his Christian identity was not just private, but public and political. When disputes arose between English and Danish subjects, or when raiders from elsewhere threatened to disrupt the peace, Guthrum worked with Alfred to resolve problems rather than allowing them to escalate into renewed warfare. The relationship between Alfred and Guthrum became a model for how Saxons and Vikings might coexist in England. It was not perfect. There were certainly tensions, violations of the peace by subordinates on both sides, cultural and religious conflicts that no treaty could entirely prevent. But it was functional, and it lasted. When Guthrum died in 890, having ruled East Anglia for 12 years as a baptized Christian keeping peace with his godfather Alfred, his death removed one of the key figures who had made coexistence possible. But the precedent had been established. The proof provided that Saxons and Danes could live side by side without constant warfare, that conversion and negotiation could sometimes accomplish what force of arms could not. The Treaty of Wedmore and the baptism of Guthrum also sent a message to other Viking leaders and armies. They demonstrated that Alfred was willing to make peace, to accept former enemies as brothers if they would convert and keep their oaths. But they also demonstrated Alfred's strength. He had defeated Guthrum, the leader who had conquered 3 kingdoms, the warrior who had driven Alfred into the marshes and seemed on the verge of total victory. Any Viking considering an attack on Wessex would have to consider whether they were more formidable than Guthrum had been, whether they wanted to test themselves against a king who had proven capable of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. For the people of Wessex, the peace after Edington was a time of relief and recovery tinged with awareness that the respite might be temporary. They had survived, but at tremendous cost. Fields had been ravaged, buildings burned, people killed or displaced. The months of Viking occupation had disrupted the normal rhythms of life, planting and harvesting, trade and craft production, all the activities that sustained a medieval society. Now, with the Vikings gone and peace established, the work of rebuilding could begin. But everyone understood that the peace depended on both sides keeping their word, and history suggested that Viking oaths were not always reliable. Alfred would use the years of peace to prepare for the next war, because he had no reason to believe that Guthrum's army would be the last Viking force to threaten Wessex. Alfred emerged from the crisis of 878 with a profound understanding of why Wessex had nearly fallen, and what would be required to prevent it from happening again. The traditional English military and political systems had proven inadequate against the Viking threat. The Firth could not match the year-round availability of Viking armies. English fortifications were too few and too weak to protect populations or serve as bases for sustained defense. The lack of a navy meant Vikings controlled rivers and coasts, giving them mobility advantages that English forces could not counter. Alfred set about reforming these systems with a thoroughness and vision that would transform Wessex and eventually all of England. The centerpiece of Alfred's military reforms was the Burh system, a network of fortified towns that would cover Wessex with defensive strongpoints. The concept was not entirely original. The Carolingian kings of Francia had developed similar systems in response to Viking raids, and Alfred had learned about these during his childhood visits to the continent. But Alfred adapted the concept to English circumstances and implemented it with systematic thoroughness that went far beyond anything attempted before in England. The burhs would serve multiple purposes. They would protect local populations, provide secure bases for military operations, serve as administrative centers, encourage trade and economic development, and demonstrate Alfred's power and organizational capability. The Burgle Heidage, a document probably compiled near the end of Alfred's reign or shortly after, lists the burhs Alfred established and the resources assigned to each. The document names 33 fortified locations scattered throughout Wessex, positioned so that no part of the kingdom was more than 20 miles, roughly a day's march, from a burh. Some were existing towns that were fortified or refortified, like Winchester, Alfred's capital, which had Roman walls that could be repaired and strengthened. Others were new foundations, built from scratch at strategically important locations, like Wareham and Shaftesbury. Some were built at old Roman forts, utilizing existing walls and defensive features. Some were built on Iron Age hill forts, taking advantage of natural defensive positions that had protected British tribes centuries before the Romans came. Each burh was assigned a number of hides, a hide being a unit of land assessment roughly equivalent to what could support a household, probably between 40 and 120 acres, depending on soil quality. The hidage assigned to a burh determined how many men it could call upon for defense and how much resources it could draw upon for construction and maintenance. The Burgle Hidage's precise calculations, it specified that every hide of land assigned to a burh should provide 1 man for defense, and that every 5.5 yards of wall required 4 men to defend, demonstrate the systematic planning that went into the system. This was not improvisation or rough approximation, but careful calculation of resources, needs, and capabilities. The construction of the burhs required enormous resources and organization. Walls had to be built, sometimes of stone if Roman ruins could be quarried for materials, more often of earth and timber in the traditional Anglo-Saxon manner. Ditches had to be dug, both to provide earth for ramparts and to create obstacles for attackers. Streets had to be laid out inside the burhs, often in grid patterns that showed Roman influence or at least systematic planning. Buildings had to be constructed, halls for local lords, churches for religious services, workshops for craftsmen, storage buildings for food and weapons. Water supplies had to be secured, either by locating burhs near rivers or by digging wells. The workforce for this massive construction program came from the same third system that provided warriors for defense, but now organized for labor rather than combat. Every free man owed service to his lord, and ultimately to the king, and that service could be military duty or labor on public works. Alfred organized the third in a new way to make this dual responsibility workable. Half would serve at any given time, whether in military duty or construction work, while the other half remained home to maintain farms and families. When one half's service period ended, they would return home, and the other half would take their place. This rotation system ensured that the kingdom's defense and construction needs could be met without completely disrupting the agricultural economy that sustained everything. The Burh system transformed the military balance between Wessex and potential Viking invaders. Previously, Viking armies could move freely through the countryside, raiding with impunity because there were few places where populations could take shelter or where English forces could establish secure bases. Now, with Burhs covering Wessex, Vikings found that every area they entered had a fortified strongpoint nearby. Local populations could retreat to the Burh when raiders approached, denying the Vikings the plunder and slaves they sought. English forces based in the Burhs could sally out to attack Viking raiders and retreat to safety if threatened with overwhelming force. Viking armies that tried to besiege Burhs found themselves vulnerable to relief forces from neighbouring Burhs, which could arrive within a day's march. The Burhs also transformed the economy of Wessex. Fortified towns attracted trade because merchants knew their goods would be safe behind walls. Markets established in Burhs became regular features, held on specific days under royal protection. Craftsmen settled in Burhs because the concentration of population created demand for their services. Some Burhs grew into significant towns. Winchester would become one of medieval England's most important cities, and others, like Oxford and Wallingford, would grow from Alfred's fortifications into major centres. The Burh system thus served both military and economic purposes, strengthening Wessex in multiple ways simultaneously. Alfred did not stop with land defences. He also created England's first real navy. The Vikings' naval superiority had been one of their greatest advantages, allowing them to move quickly along coasts and up rivers, to strike unexpectedly and retreat before English forces could respond. Alfred commissioned the construction of ships specifically designed to counter Viking vessels. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, these ships were longer and faster than the Viking ships, carried more warriors, and were built to Alfred's own design specifications. Whether Alfred personally designed these ships or merely approved designs created by experienced shipwrights is unclear, but the Chronicle's attribution suggests Alfred took close personal interest in the project. The effectiveness of Alfred's navy was mixed. The Chronicle records several sea battles between English and Viking ships, with varying results. In 882, Alfred's ships defeated 4 Viking vessels, capturing or sinking them in a successful engagement that demonstrated the potential of naval power. But in other instances, English ships ran aground or were defeated by more experienced Viking crews. Building ships was one thing. Training crews to use them effectively was another, and the English lacked the generations of seafaring tradition that made the Scandinavians such formidable sailors. Nevertheless, the existence of an English navy changed the strategic situation. Vikings could no longer assume unchallenged control of England's waters, had to consider the possibility that their ships might be intercepted or attacked, had to garrison their fleets more heavily to protect against English raids. The military reforms extended to the organization and equipment of the army itself. Alfred could not transform the fired into professional soldiers. The economic base did not exist to support large numbers of full-time warriors, but he could improve training, standardize equipment, and ensure that when the fyrd was called up, it consisted of men who knew what was expected of them and had at least basic military skills. He may have established something like a standing force of household warriors and garrison troops for the Burhs, men who served year-round and formed the professional corps around which the fyrd militia could be organized when needed. Alfred also reformed the taxation and administrative systems to support his military reforms, building and maintaining 33 Burhs, constructing and crewing a fleet of warships, supplying armies that might campaign for months. All of this required money and organizational capacity beyond what had previously existed in Wessex. The hidage assessments that determined how much each landowner owed in taxes and service were systematized and recorded. Royal officials called reeves were given expanded responsibilities for collecting taxes, organizing fyrd contingents, and supervising Burh construction. The kingdom's administration, which had been relatively informal and decentralized, became more systematic and bureaucratic, though still modest by modern standards. The coinage system was also reformed during this period. Alfred's coins, struck at mints in Winchester and other towns, became more standardized in weight and fineness, making them reliable stores of value and media of exchange. The coins bore Alfred's image and name, proclaiming his authority and reminding everyone who used them of the king's power. The economic growth encouraged by the Burh system, combined with the increased demand for silver to pay taxes and support the military, made currency more important to Wessex's economy than it had been before. Alfred was creating not just a military defense system, but the economic and administrative infrastructure of a more sophisticated state. By the mid-880s, less than a decade after the disaster at Chippenham, Alfred had transformed Wessex from a nearly conquered kingdom, barely clinging to survival, into the strongest English realm, with military capabilities and political organization that no other kingdom could match. The Burhs stood as physical symbols of this transformation. Solid walls protecting towns where people could live and work without constant fear. Fortifications that any invader would have to deal with. Evidence that Alfred had learned from his defeats and built a kingdom that could defend itself. When the Vikings came again, as Alfred knew they eventually would, they would find a very different Wessex than the one Guthrum had nearly conquered. Alfred's commitment to learning and education was as passionate and significant as his military reforms, though perhaps less immediately visible in its effects. From childhood, he had loved books and knowledge, had memorized poetry when he could not yet read, had visited Rome and the Carolingian court and seen what learning could accomplish. But for much of his life, that love had been frustrated. He remained illiterate in Latin until at least his 30s, dependent on others to read the texts he wanted to understand, unable to access the treasures of knowledge locked in manuscripts written in the language of learning. The painful irony of a king who valued wisdom above almost everything, yet lacked the basic skill to read the books containing that wisdom, drove Alfred to ensure that future generations would not face the same obstacle. Alfred's vision of educational reform was rooted in his understanding of why England had fallen to the Vikings. He believed, and stated explicitly in his writings, that God had allowed the pagan invasions as punishment for England's sins, and chief among those sins was the decline of learning and piety. In previous generations, England had been a centre of Christian learning. The Venerable Bede, Alcuin of York, and other English scholars had been renowned throughout Europe, had produced books and taught students from many lands. But by Alfred's time, that tradition had largely died out. Monasteries that had preserved learning were destroyed or disrupted by Viking raids. Scholars fled or were killed. Latin literacy, essential for reading the Bible and other religious texts, became rare even among the clergy who were supposed to be the educated class. The results of this decline in learning were, in Alfred's view, catastrophic. Priests could not read the prayers they were supposed to say. Monks could not understand the rules they were supposed to follow. Noblemen could not read the laws they were supposed to obey. Knowledge accumulated over centuries was locked away in manuscripts that no one in England could read anymore, like treasures in boxes whose keys had been lost. Alfred saw this as both symptom and cause of England's troubles, a people ignorant of their own religious and legal traditions, cut off from the wisdom of the past, stumbling through darkness when they might have had light. Alfred's response was characteristically ambitious and practical. He could not personally restore all the learning that had been lost, could not train a generation of scholars overnight, but he could take immediate steps to make essential knowledge available to those who needed it. His first major initiative was a program of translation, taking the most important Latin texts and rendering them into Old English so that people who knew only their native language could access their contents. This might seem obvious to modern readers, but it was actually quite radical for the time. Latin was the language of the church and learning, the language that united educated people across Europe. Translating key texts into vernacular languages risked fragmenting that shared intellectual culture and suggesting that English was as valid as Latin for serious literature. But Alfred prioritized accessibility over tradition. What good were books that no one could read? What value was wisdom if it remained locked away in an incomprehensible language? He identified several works that he considered essential for anyone in authority, texts that would teach them how to live righteously and govern justly. These included Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, a guide for bishops on how to teach and lead their flocks, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a meditation on fate, free will, and how to find peace in troubled times, Augustine's Soliloquies, a philosophical dialogue about the soul and God, Orosius's History Against the Pagans, a Christian interpretation of world history, and the first 50 Psalms from the Bible. Alfred personally translated at least some of these works, while others were translated under his supervision and with his participation. Alfred's translations were not mere word-for-word renderings, but adaptations that made the material accessible and relevant to his English audience. He added explanatory notes when passages might be unclear, drew connections to English experiences and circumstances, sometimes expanded or commented on the original text to make its lessons more applicable. In his preface to the translation of Pastoral Care, Alfred wrote movingly about his concerns for learning in England and his vision for renewal. He described how he remembered better times when churches stood whole and learning flourished, and he lamented the current state where very few on this side of the Humber who could understand their rituals in English, or indeed could translate a letter from Latin into English. His solution was that all free-born youth who had the means should be taught to read English, and those destined for church careers should also learn Latin. To implement this vision, Alfred established schools. He created a court school at Winchester, where children of the nobility could be educated alongside children of lesser status who showed promise. This was radical. Education had been almost exclusively the province of the church, provided mainly to those destined for religious vocations. Alfred secularized education to some degree, making it available to those who would become administrators, judges, military commanders, and other lay leaders. He recruited teachers from wherever he could find them, from Wales, from the continent, from the few remaining centres of learning in England. His biographer, Asser, a Welsh monk from St. David's, was one such recruit who came to Alfred's court and served as the king's personal tutor, as well as a teacher in the court school. Alfred was over 30, possibly close to 40, when he finally learned to read Latin himself. Asser described how Alfred would keep a book with him constantly, pulling it out to read whenever he had a spare moment between his royal duties. The dedication required for a busy king, managing a kingdom still under threat, dealing with constant administrative and military matters, suffering from chronic illness, to teach himself a new language in his spare time is remarkable. But Alfred was determined not just to sponsor learning, but to participate in it himself, to set an example for his nobles and subjects that learning was valuable at any age and for anyone, even a king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most important sources for early English history, was compiled during Alfred's reign, probably beginning around 890. The Chronicle was not a neutral historical record, but a political document, presenting events from the perspective of the West Saxon royal house and emphasizing Alfred's accomplishments. but it was also a remarkable achievement, a history written in English rather than Latin, accessible to anyone who could read the vernacular, preserving information that would otherwise have been lost. The chronicle was distributed to monasteries throughout Alfred's realm and was updated year by year, creating an ongoing record of events. It would continue to be maintained for centuries after Alfred's death, eventually becoming one of the longest-running historical chronicles in medieval Europe. Alfred also promoted the copying of manuscripts, both of his translations and of other important works. He established or restored scriptoria, workshops where monks copied texts by hand, the only way of reproducing books before printing was invented. Each manuscript was precious, representing hundreds of hours of skilled labor, and the creation of new copies meant that knowledge could spread and survive even if individual manuscripts were lost or destroyed. Alfred apparently gave copies of his translation of Pastoral Care to every bishop in his kingdom, ensuring that church leaders would have access to this important guide in a language they could understand. The educational reforms had effects that went beyond Alfred's lifetime. By making Old English a literary language, a language in which important works could be written and read, Alfred helped preserve and develop English as a distinct cultural identity. In an age when many vernacular languages were considered too crude for serious literature, when Latin dominated intellectual life, Alfred's insistence on English literacy helped ensure that English would survive as more than just a spoken language. The tradition of writing in English, established during Alfred's reign, would continue and eventually produce some of the greatest works of medieval literature, including Beowulf and the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer centuries later. Alfred's reforms also had practical administrative benefits. A literate population of officials and nobles could read laws and charters, could keep records, could handle the increased bureaucratic complexity that Alfred's other reforms required. The Burh system, the reformed taxation, the military organization, all of these required literate administrators who could keep track of resources, obligations, and deployments. Education was not just about preserving Christian wisdom or maintaining cultural traditions. It was also about creating the human capital necessary to run a more sophisticated kingdom. The king, who had once been unable to read, who had felt the frustration of being cut off from knowledge he desperately wanted, became in his mature years one of medieval Europe's most learned rulers. He debated with scholars who visited his court, contributed his own insights to theological and philosophical questions, wrote extensively himself in addition to his translations. He became, in his own right, a scholar king who demonstrated that intellectual pursuits and military leadership were not incompatible but rather complementary, that wisdom strengthened power rather than weakening it. When later generations looked back at Alfred's accomplishments, many would rate his educational reforms as highly as his military victories, recognizing that he had saved not just England's political independence, but also its cultural and intellectual heritage. Alfred understood that military strength and cultural renewal alone were not sufficient to create a lasting kingdom. He needed to establish justice and law that would govern his people fairly and earn their loyalty. The legal system he inherited was fragmented and inconsistent, a patchwork of local customs, royal edicts from previous kings, and church laws that sometimes contradicted each other. There was no unified code that people could consult to know what the law required, no consistent standards for how crimes should be punished or disputes resolved. Alfred set out to create such a code, compiling what became known as the Doom Book, or the Laws of Alfred, drawing on multiple sources to create something comprehensive and coherent. The structure of Alfred's law code revealed his worldview and priorities. He began not with secular laws, but with a lengthy introduction drawn from the Book of Exodus, specifically the Ten Commandments and other Mosaic laws from the Bible. By starting with divine law, Alfred established that his authority came from God, that the laws he promulgated were not merely his personal preferences, but reflected eternal principles of justice. He made explicit the connection between Christian morality and secular law, suggesting that a good Christian should naturally be a law-abiding subject, and that a lawbreaker was in some sense a sinner as well as a criminal. After the biblical introduction, Alfred included excerpts from earlier English law codes, particularly those of King Inny of Wessex, who had ruled in the early 700s. This demonstrated continuity with the past, showing that Alfred was not inventing new laws from nothing but rather building on established traditions. It also gave his code historical legitimacy. He was not an innovator disrupting tradition, but a restorer bringing order to what had become chaotic. Following Inny's laws, Alfred added his own new laws, addressing situations and problems that earlier codes had not covered, or that recent events had made more pressing. One of the most striking features of Alfred's laws was their attention to the protection of the weak and vulnerable. Medieval society was brutally hierarchical, with sharp distinctions between nobles, freemen, and slaves. Laws typically assigned different values to people based on their social status. Killing a nobleman carried a far heavier penalty than killing a commoner, and killing a slave might be treated as mere property damage. Alfred's laws maintained these hierarchical distinctions because eliminating them would have been unthinkable in his society, but they also included unusual provisions protecting those at the bottom of society. The Vergild system, the compensation paid for killing or injuring someone, was central to Anglo-Saxon law, and Alfred's code specified these payments in detail. A Vergild was not just about compensating victims or their families, but also about preventing blood feuds. If someone killed your relative, you had two options: seek revenge through violence, potentially starting a cycle of killing that could last generations, or accept the Vergild payment and consider the matter settled. By making the Vergild payments mandatory and standardizing them in law, Alfred encouraged peaceful resolution of disputes that might otherwise have torn communities apart. Alfred's code also addressed the treatment of wives, children, servants, and slaves with more attention to their welfare than was typical for the time. While it did not grant them anything approaching modern concepts of rights, it did establish limits on how they could be treated, recognizing them as human beings with some protections under law, rather than merely as property. A master could punish a slave, but not arbitrarily kill one. A husband had authority over his wife, but there were limits to that authority. These provisions were modest by modern standards, but represented real progress in a society where the powerful often faced few restraints on their behavior toward the powerless. The law code dealt extensively with property rights, theft, fraud, and commercial disputes, the everyday legal matters that medieval courts spent most of their time adjudicating. The penalties for theft varied depending on the value of what was stolen and the circumstances of the crime. Stealing to feed a starving family was treated differently than stealing for profit. First offences were punished less severely than repeated crimes. The code attempted to balance the need to protect property rights with recognition that circumstances could sometimes excuse or mitigate wrongdoing. Violence and assault also received detailed attention. The code specified different penalties for different types of wounds: cutting off a hand versus cutting off a finger, blinding versus merely bruising, killing versus merely wounding. These detailed distinctions might seem gruesome to modern sensibilities, but they reflected the reality of a violent age and the need to establish some proportionality in punishment. The code also addressed sexual crimes, with provisions protecting women from assault and rape. though the penalties and procedures reflected medieval assumptions about women's subordinate status that modern readers would find deeply problematic. One of the most remarkable provisions in Alfred's code concerned treason and betrayal of one's lord. Alfred declared that this was the one crime that could not be compensated with money, the one offence so serious that it required death or exile rather than payment of fines. He justified this by reference to Christianity, just as Judas's betrayal of Christ could not be forgiven with mere payment, just as God's judgment on those who reject him cannot be bought off, so earthly lords must treat betrayal as unforgivable. This reflected Alfred's understanding of lordship as a sacred bond, not merely a political or economic relationship, but something that touched on the divine order itself. The code also addressed the administration of justice, specifying who could judge what types of cases and what procedures should be followed. Local 100 courts, presided over by 100 men or other local officials, would handle minor cases. Shire courts, meeting several times a year with the ealdorman or his representative presiding, would handle more serious matters. The king's own court would serve as a final court of appeal and would hear cases involving major crimes or disputes that could not be resolved at lower levels. This hierarchy of courts provided multiple levels of justice, ensuring that cases could be escalated if local resolution proved impossible. Trial procedures in Alfred's code still included elements that modern readers would consider superstitious or unjust. Trial by ordeal, requiring the accused to carry hot iron, plunge a hand into boiling water, or undergo some other physical test, with guilt or innocence determined by whether the wounds healed cleanly, remained an accepted practice. The theory was that God would intervene to protect the innocent, causing their wounds to heal miraculously quickly, while allowing the guilty to suffer infection and slow healing. Alfred, despite his learning and wisdom, apparently accepted this as a legitimate method of determining truth when human witnesses and evidence were insufficient. The medieval worldview assumed divine intervention in human affairs in ways that modern secular legal systems do not. The compilation and promulgation of Alfred's law code around 890 had lasting significance beyond the specific provisions it contained. It established the principle that law should be written and accessible, that people should be able to know what was required of them, rather than being subject to the arbitrary whims of judges. It demonstrated that even a king was bound by law, that justice should follow consistent principles rather than varying based on personal favor or political convenience. Later English legal developments, including the common law system that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world, would build on foundations that Alfred laid. Alfred's laws were not perfect by any standard, ancient or modern. They reflected the assumptions and limitations of 9th century Christian Anglo-Saxon society, with all its hierarchies, violence, and religious certainties. But within that context, they represented serious attempts to create justice, to protect the weak from the strong, to establish order without tyranny, to balance competing interests and values. The king who fought Vikings with sword and spear also fought for justice with pen and parchment, understanding that a kingdom needed both military power and moral legitimacy to endure. The year 886 marked another turning point in Alfred's reign, less dramatic than the Battle of Edington, but perhaps equally significant for the long-term future of England. London, the great trading city on the Thames, had been under Viking control since 871, occupied by Guthrum's forces and then by other Danish settlers. The city's strategic and economic importance was enormous. It sat at the centre of trade routes connecting Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and the continent, and whoever controlled London controlled access to much of England's commercial wealth. For 15 years, Alfred had lacked the power to reclaim it, but by 886, Wessex was strong enough to make the attempt. The circumstances of London's capture are not entirely clear from the surviving sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states simply that Alfred occupied London in 886, without describing a battle or siege. This has led historians to speculate that perhaps the city was taken peacefully, through negotiation rather than force, possibly with the cooperation of English inhabitants who preferred Saxon rule to Danish occupation. Or perhaps there was a military campaign that the Chronicle chose not to describe in detail. What matters is the result. London returned to English control, and with it came the symbolic and practical advantages of holding England's most important city. Alfred immediately set about restoring and fortifying London. The city's Roman walls, built 700 years earlier, still stood, but had fallen into disrepair. Alfred ordered them repaired and strengthened, making London into one of his burhs, a fortified strongpoint that could resist siege and serve as a base for controlling the surrounding region. He also began restoring the city's economic infrastructure, rebuilding wharves and markets that had been damaged or neglected during the Viking occupation, encouraging merchants to return, re-establishing the mints that would produce coins bearing his image and name. London, under Alfred's rule, would become not just a military stronghold, but an economic powerhouse that would help fund the continued defence of Wessex. But Alfred did not keep London for himself. Instead, in a move that demonstrated both political wisdom and personal restraint, he entrusted the city to Ethelred, Ealdorman of Mercia. This Ethelred was not a puppet like Ceolwulf II had been, but a legitimate Mercian nobleman who had maintained his independence and authority even as Viking forces conquered and occupied much of his kingdom. By giving London to Ethelred rather than keeping it as part of Wessex, Alfred accomplished several things at once. He strengthened his alliance with Mercia, demonstrating that he could be trusted and was not simply using Mercia's weakness to expand his own territory. He acknowledged that London, historically part of Mercia, should be returned to Mercian governance, now that English forces controlled it again, and he created an obligation. Ethelred would owe Alfred for this generous act, creating a relationship of mutual loyalty and support. Alfred strengthened the alliance with Mercia through family ties as well. His daughter, Ethelfled, now probably in her late teens and already demonstrating the remarkable intelligence and courage that would later make her legendary, was married to Ealdorman Ethelred. This marriage bound Wessex and Mercia together through kinship, creating a relationship that went beyond mere political alliance to something more personal and enduring. Ethelfled would eventually become far more than just a political marriage pawn. She would effectively rule Mercia alongside her husband, and after his death would rule alone as the Lady of the Mercians, carrying on her father's work of defending England against Vikings, and even leading armies in battle herself. The capture of London and the alliance with Mercia allowed Alfred to claim a new title. Coins minted after 886, and some charters from this period refer to Alfred as Rex Anglorum, King of the English, or more literally, King of the Angles, rather than merely King of Wessex or King of the West Saxons. This was an extraordinary claim, suggesting that Alfred ruled, or at least had authority, over all English people, regardless of which kingdom they lived in. Technically, this was an exaggeration. Alfred did not rule Northumbria or East Anglia, which remained under Viking control, but he did effectively control Wessex, and had significant influence over what remained of English Mercia through his alliance with Ethelred. More importantly, the title expressed Alfred's vision of what England could become, not four separate kingdoms constantly fighting each other, but a unified English realm under a single king. The formal treaty of Alfred and Guthrum was probably finalized around this time. turning the informal peace established at Wedmore in 878 into a detailed written agreement. This treaty survives in multiple versions, though the exact date is debated by historians. Some place it as early as 879, others as late as 886, or even later. What seems most likely is that the basic terms were agreed at Wedmore, but the detailed written treaty was not finalized until after Alfred captured London and needed to formally establish boundaries between English and Danish territories. The treaty specified the border between Alfred's England and Guthrum's Danelaw. The boundary ran up the Thames to the River Lee, then up the Lee to its source, then in a straight line to Bedford, then up the River Ouse to Watling Street, the old Roman road that ran northwest across England. This left Guthrum in control of East Anglia and the eastern portions of Mercia, while Alfred controlled Wessex and the western portions of Mercia. The treaty also established equal Virgiled values for English and Danish noblemen, suggesting that Englishmen and Danes would be treated equally under law, at least in theory. It included provisions about trade, setting rules for commercial transactions between English and Danish territories, and specifying how disputes would be resolved. The treaty represented pragmatic acceptance of reality. The Vikings had conquered and settled large parts of England, and those conquests could not be easily reversed. But it also created a framework for coexistence, establishing that Saxons and Danes could live side by side without constant warfare, that boundaries and laws could regulate their interactions. The treaty assumed that both English and Danish populations would continue to exist in England, that neither would be expelled or exterminated, but that they could be separated enough to minimize conflict while maintaining necessary connections for trade and diplomacy. The concept of the Danelaw, the region under Danish law, became formalized through this treaty. In the Danelaw, Danish customs, legal traditions, and social structures prevailed. Villages and farms were organized differently than in Saxon England. Legal procedures followed Danish rather than English precedent. Even the language began to change, as Old English mixed with Old Norse to create new dialect forms and new vocabulary. Place names reflected Danish settlement, towns ending in by or thorp, rather than the Saxon tun or ham. Names honoring Scandinavian gods or using Danish words for topographical features. The Danelaw was becoming a hybrid culture, neither fully Danish nor fully English, but something new. For Alfred, the treaty was both a diplomatic success and a recognition of limits to his power. He had saved Wessex, had extended his influence over parts of Mercia, had established himself as the most powerful English king and the defender of English independence. But he had not driven the Vikings from England, had not restored the old kingdoms, had not accomplished total victory. The Vikings were now permanent residents of England, ruling their own territories under their own laws. Future English kings would have to either accept this division or attempt the long, difficult task of reconquest. Alfred, having fought Vikings for 20 years and understanding how difficult they were to defeat, accepted the division, at least for now. The alliance with Mercia and the control of London gave Alfred resources and strategic depth he had previously lacked. If Vikings attacked from the east, they would have to fight through Mercian defences before reaching Wessex. If they attacked from the north, London served as a strongpoint that could threaten their supply lines. The Burh system now extended beyond Wessex's original borders into Mercian territory, creating a defensive network that covered much of southern England. Alfred's military reforms, his administrative improvements, his educational initiatives, all of these could now benefit not just Wessex but also English Mercia, strengthening the entire English realm against future threats. The period from 886 to 892 was relatively peaceful, at least compared to the constant warfare of earlier years. Guthrum kept the peace until his death in 890, and no major new Viking invasions threatened England during this time. Alfred used these years to consolidate his reforms, to strengthen the Burh system, to promote learning and law, to build the institutions that would allow Wessex and English Mercia to resist future invasions. But he did not forget that peace with Vikings was always temporary, that new threats would eventually emerge. He prepared for the next war, while grateful for the respite from the last one. The peace that had held since the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum was shattered in 892, when a massive Viking army arrived on England's shores. This was not a single warband, but a coalition of forces that had spent years ravaging the continent, particularly along the Seine in Francia. The Frankish kingdoms had eventually mobilized effective resistance, making continued campaigning there unprofitable and dangerous. The Vikings, looking for easier targets and richer plunder, turned their attention back to England, landing in Kent with a force that may have numbered in the thousands. They brought not just warriors, but families, women and children, wagons loaded with possessions. This was not a raiding party, but a migration, an army intending to conquer and settle. The scale of this new invasion was intimidating. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that 330 ships arrived, which, even accounting for medieval exaggeration, suggests a force much larger than what Guthrum had commanded in 878. The army split into two main groups. The larger force established a base at Appledore in Kent, while a smaller force under a leader named Haston, who had his own ambitions and agenda, settled at Milton, also in Kent. The presence of women, children, and baggage trains indicated that these Vikings intended to stay, to carve out new kingdoms for themselves in England, as their predecessors had done in Northumbria and East Anglia. But the England they invaded in 892 was very different from the England of 865, when the Great Heathen Army first landed. Alfred had spent 14 years since Edington rebuilding, reforming, and fortifying his kingdom. The Burh system was complete, covering Wessex and English Mercia with a network of fortified towns. The Fyrd was organised with half always in service, while the other half maintained farms and families. The navy, while not dominant, existed and could contest Viking control of waters. Most importantly, Alfred had experience. He understood Viking tactics, knew how they thought and fought, and had developed strategies to counter them. The campaign that followed demonstrated both Alfred's strategic acumen and the effectiveness of his reforms. Rather than trying to confront the entire Viking army in a single pitched battle, which would have been risky given their numerical advantage, Alfred employed a strategy of containment and harassment. He used fortified burhs to restrict Viking movement, making it dangerous for them to raid too far from their bases. He positioned field armies to shadow the Viking forces, ready to intercept raids or attack if the Vikings divided their forces. He coordinated with his son Edward, now old enough to command forces, and with his son-in-law Ethelred of Mercia, creating multiple forces that could support each other while covering more territory than a single army could manage. The Vikings tried various strategies to break out of the containment. Haston's force moved north into the Midlands, attempting to march up the Thames Valley and outflank Alfred's defences. But English forces intercepted them, and in a battle that the Chronicle recorded with satisfaction, the English captured Haston's wife and 2 sons, along with significant booty. Alfred, displaying the magnanimity that characterized his treatment of defeated enemies, returned Haston's family to him unharmed. He had been godfather to one of Haston's sons during an earlier baptism ceremony, creating a spiritual kinship that Alfred honored, even though Haston had broken his oaths by invading England. Whether this generosity was motivated by Christian mercy, by hope that Haston might keep his word in the future, or by calculation that treating captives well might encourage other Vikings to surrender, the gesture demonstrated Alfred's understanding that warfare had diplomatic and moral dimensions as well as military ones. The larger Viking army at Appledore tried different tactics, moving west into Wessex in a series of raids designed to gather plunder and potentially establish a new base. But everywhere they went, they found Burhs blocking access to the richest areas, local forces ready to harass them, and Alfred's main army ready to intercept any major movement. The Vikings captured no major towns, established no secure bases in Wessex, found that the kingdom they had hoped to conquer was now too well defended to be easily overcome. The contrast with 878 could not have been more stark. Then, a single surprise attack at Chippenham had nearly ended Alfred's reign. Now, a force several times larger could not make meaningful progress despite years of campaigning. In 893, portions of the Viking army tried sailing up the Thames, attempting to use their traditional advantages in riverine mobility to bypass Alfred's land defences. But the English navy and shore-based forces intercepted them, and the Burhs along the Thames prevented them from establishing bases or gathering supplies. The Vikings were forced to retreat, having accomplished nothing. In 894, they tried yet another strategy, moving north into the Danelaw, perhaps hoping to be reinforced by Danish settlers from East Anglia and Northumbria. But Guthrum was dead, and his successors were less interested in warfare against Alfred, with whom they had peaceful and profitable relations, than in protecting their own territories. Throughout these campaigns, Alfred demonstrated the patient strategic thinking that had been developing since his early defeats. He did not need to destroy the Viking army. He merely needed to prevent it from accomplishing its objectives. Every failed raid, every attempt to establish a base that was thwarted, every month that passed without the Vikings making progress, made their position more precarious. They could not sustain an army of thousands indefinitely without plunder or tribute. Their supplies were running low, their morale was declining, and the easy conquest they had expected was proving impossible. By 896, after 4 years of fruitless campaigning, the Viking army was dissolving. Some Vikings settled in the Danelaw, accepting land and swearing oaths to the Danish kings who ruled there. Others returned to the continent, looking for better opportunities elsewhere. A few tried to continue raiding in England, but by now they were small bands rather than a coordinated army, and they were easily defeated or driven off by local forces. The great invasion that had seemed so threatening in 892 had ended not with a climactic battle, but with exhaustion and dispersion, defeated more by Alfred's strategic patience than by military action. The campaign of 892-896 was Alfred's final test, the last major Viking threat he would face. He was now in his late 40s, worn down by years of warfare and by the illness that had plagued him since his wedding day. But he had prevailed one last time, had demonstrated that the Wessex he had rebuilt was strong enough to resist even massive invasions. The Burh system had worked, the military reforms had worked, the alliances with Mercia and with the Christian Danes of the Danelaw had worked. Everything Alfred had spent 2 decades building had been tested under pressure and had proven effective. The Vikings would continue to be a presence in England. They controlled the Danelaw, would launch new invasions in future generations, would remain a constant concern for English kings, but they would never again come as close to conquering all of England as they had in 878, when Alfred fled to Athelney. The kingdom Alfred saved and strengthened would survive him, would continue to resist Viking attacks under his son and grandson, and would eventually reconquer the territories lost to Danish settlement. The foundation for a unified English kingdom, built by Alfred through decades of warfare, reform and determination, would prove enduring enough to support the edifice his descendants would construct upon it. Behind every public triumph, every victory over Vikings, every legal reform and educational initiative, Alfred lived with private suffering that never entirely left him. The mysterious illness that first struck on his wedding day to Ealhswith continued throughout his life, coming in waves that varied in intensity, but never completely disappeared. Some days were bearable, allowing him to function almost normally, to attend to his royal duties, to lead armies, to study and write. Other days were agonizing, confining him to his chambers, making even the simplest activities torture, forcing him to hide his suffering from his people who needed to see their king as strong and capable. Asser, Alfred's biographer, and one of the few people who witnessed the king's suffering firsthand, provided descriptions of the symptoms that have allowed modern medical historians to speculate about possible diagnoses. The pain was primarily abdominal, severe enough to double Alfred over and leave him gasping. It came in attacks that could last hours or days, then would subside, leaving him exhausted but functional until the next attack. The pain made riding difficult, a serious problem for a king who needed to travel constantly to manage his kingdom and lead armies. It affected his digestion, forcing him to restrict his diet severely, avoiding the rich meats and strong ales that other nobles consumed freely. The illness was unpredictable, striking without warning, making it impossible for Alfred to plan his days with confidence. The medical theories of Alfred's time had no real understanding of diseases of the digestive system. Physicians might attribute such symptoms to an imbalance of humours, too much bile or phlegm disrupting the body's equilibrium, and prescribe treatments based on restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, or dietary modifications. They might suggest that the illness had spiritual causes, that Alfred was being tested by God, or was suffering for some sin, known or unknown. Some people, always eager to find supernatural explanations for the mysterious, whispered about curses or witchcraft, suggesting that Alfred's enemies had worked evil magic against him. But none of these theories led to effective treatments, and Alfred endured his illness without real medical relief for more than 30 years. Modern physicians, analyzing Asser's descriptions and Alfred's symptoms, have proposed Crohn's disease as the most likely diagnosis. Crohn's disease is a chronic inflammatory condition of the digestive tract, particularly the intestines, that causes exactly the kinds of symptoms Asser described: severe abdominal pain, digestive difficulties, unpredictable attacks, and chronic suffering that can last for decades. The disease has no cure even with modern medicine, though it can be managed with drugs and sometimes surgery. In Alfred's time, with no understanding of inflammatory conditions and no effective treatments, he would have simply had to endure the attacks, manage his diet as best he could to minimize triggers, and push through the pain when royal duties demanded it. The disease would have been particularly difficult for someone in Alfred's position. A king was expected to lead armies, to ride for hours or days during military campaigns, to present an image of strength and vitality that would inspire confidence in his followers. Alfred could not admit to weakness, could not let his enemies know that he was often incapacitated by pain, could not afford to be seen as sickly or failing. He had to project strength even when feeling weak, had to mount his horse and ride even when every step caused agony, had to make decisions and issue orders even when pain made clear thinking difficult. The mental and emotional toll of maintaining this facade while suffering privately must have been exhausting. Asser recorded that Alfred suffered from depression in connection with his illness, which is hardly surprising given the circumstances. Chronic pain that cannot be relieved, that disrupts life constantly, that has no cure and no end in sight. Such conditions naturally lead to despair. Alfred must have wondered sometimes why God allowed him to suffer this way. why he was afflicted with this burden on top of all the other challenges of ruling a kingdom under constant threat. He must have had moments of darkness when the pain was too severe and the future looked too bleak, when he questioned whether he could continue bearing what seemed unbearable. But Alfred did continue, day after day, year after year, for more than 3 decades. His faith helped, the Christian belief that suffering could be redemptive, that God tested those he loved, that earthly pain was temporary compared to eternal rewards. Alfred found meaning in his suffering by connecting it to Christ's suffering, by seeing his own trials as a way of participating in divine purpose. He also found strength in his sense of duty. He was king, not for his own benefit, but to serve his people. And service required sacrifice, including the sacrifice of his own comfort and health. Alfred's grandfather, King Egbert of Wessex, apparently suffered from similar symptoms, suggesting that the condition might have been hereditary. If Alfred knew this family history, it may have been some small comfort to know he was not uniquely cursed, that others had suffered similarly and still managed to rule effectively. But it also meant he had no hope that age would bring relief. This would be his companion for life, growing neither better nor worse, but simply continuing until death finally ended it. The illness shaped Alfred in ways that went beyond the physical symptoms. It taught him empathy for suffering, made him more compassionate toward the poor and sick who also endured hardships they could not escape. It taught him patience and endurance, the ability to continue functioning even when circumstances seemed impossible. It taught him to treasure the good days and good moments, to make the most of periods when the pain receded enough, to allow clear thinking and vigorous action. And it taught him that strength was not the absence of weakness, but the ability to function despite weakness, to achieve great things even while bearing great burdens. When Alfred's contemporaries praised him, when his biographer Asser wrote of his virtues and accomplishments, they did so knowing that everything he achieved was accomplished while suffering from debilitating illness. This made his achievements even more remarkable in their eyes. Any king could win battles and enact reforms when healthy and vigorous, but to do so while constantly in pain, while never knowing when the next attack would strike, while maintaining the facade of royal strength despite private agony, that required something more than ordinary courage or capability. It required the iron determination that defined Alfred's character from his childhood memorization of poetry through his flight to Athelney and beyond. The pain never left Alfred. It would be with him until his last breath, a constant companion through all his triumphs and defeats, his joys and sorrows. But he never let it define him, never let it prevent him from being the king his people needed. The man who could endure years of chronic illness without surrendering to despair was the same man who could endure months in the Marshes without surrendering his kingdom, who could fight back from defeat to victory, who could build a legacy that would last 1,000 years. The illness was part of who Alfred was, but it was not the whole of who he was, and that distinction made all the difference. Behind the public figure of Alfred the king, warrior and scholar, there was Alfred the husband, father and family man, whose personal relationships shaped both his private happiness and his kingdom's future. His marriage to Ealhswith, begun in 868 when both were young, endured for more than 30 years despite the strains of constant warfare, royal responsibilities, and Alfred's chronic illness. Ealhswith remained in the background of public life, never receiving the title of queen, rarely mentioned in official documents, almost invisible in the historical record. But her presence was constant, providing stability and support through the darkest days. During the flight from Chippenham in 878, Ealhswith went into exile with Alfred, sharing the hardships of Athelney and the uncertainty of those terrible months. She raised their children through constant upheaval, manage the royal household during peacetime and war, and maintain the family bonds that would prove crucial to England's future. When Alfred honoured her in his will, leaving her 3 symbolically important estates: Edington, where he won his great victory, Lambourne, near another victory, and Wantage, where he was born, he acknowledged the partnership they had shared and the value of her quiet support throughout their years together. Their children were Alfred's greatest legacy, each playing important roles in continuing his work. Ethelfled, the eldest daughter, became arguably the most remarkable of Alfred's offspring. Married to Ealdorman Ethelred of Mercia to seal the alliance between Wessex and Mercia, she became far more than a diplomatic pawn. She fought alongside her husband against Viking raids, helped govern Mercia, and demonstrated military and political skills that earned widespread respect. After Ethelred's death around 911, Ethelfled ruled Mercia alone as the Lady of the Mercians, leading armies in battle, fortifying towns, extending Mercian power northward, and working in close coordination with her brother Edward, who had succeeded Alfred as king. She was remembered by chroniclers as a formidable warrior and wise ruler, inheriting her father's courage and strategic thinking. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son and successor, would prove himself an even more successful military commander than his father, though he had the advantage of building on foundations Alfred had laid. He reigned from 899 to 924, extending West Saxon control northward through systematic campaigns that reconquered the southern Danelaw, building new burhs to secure captured territory, and generally completing the project of unifying England under a single royal house that Alfred had begun. Edward's success depended heavily on the military reforms, the Burh system, the alliances, and the administrative structures his father had created. Without Alfred's groundwork, Edward's campaigns would not have been possible. Another daughter, Elfrith, married Baldwin II, Count of Flanders, creating an alliance with one of the most powerful nobles on the continent and giving Alfred connections across the English Channel. This marriage had strategic importance. Flanders had a strong naval tradition and controlled ports that Vikings used as bases for raids on both Francia and England. By allying with Flanders, Alfred gained potential support against Viking threats and ensured that at least one major continental power had good relations with Wessex. Elfrith's descendants would include Matilda of Flanders, who married William the Conqueror and became Queen of England after the Norman conquest, ensuring that Alfred's bloodline would continue in the English royal family even after the Saxon dynasty ended. Ethelgifu, another daughter, became abbess of Shaftesbury Abbey, one of the religious foundations Alfred either established or significantly supported. Her position gave Alfred influence over the abbey and its resources, but it also provided Ethelgifu with power and authority in her own right. Abbesses of major monasteries were important figures in medieval society, managing significant estates, supervising communities of nuns, and participating in the spiritual and sometimes political life of the kingdom. Alfred ensured that his daughters, not just his sons, would have positions of importance and influence. Ethelwerd, Alfred's younger son, appears less frequently in the sources, but apparently received education and training appropriate for a royal prince. As a younger son with an older brother to inherit the throne, his position was potentially awkward. Royal younger sons sometimes became focal points for rebellions or succession disputes, but Alfred seems to have managed this successfully, ensuring that Edward's succession was accepted and that Ethelwerd had a role and position that did not threaten the stability of the kingdom. Alfred took his children's education seriously in ways that reflected his own love of learning and his belief that education was essential for leadership. All of them, daughters as well as sons, were taught to read, both in English and, for those destined for church careers or who showed particular aptitude, in Latin. This was unusual for the time, especially the education of daughters, but Alfred believed that learning enriched life and strengthened character, that understanding history and philosophy and religion made people better leaders and better Christians, and that the royal family should set an example of learning for the kingdom. The family Alfred created extended beyond his immediate children to include grandchildren who would carry on his legacy. Through Ethelfled came descendants who would play important roles in Mercian affairs. Through Edward came a line of kings who would rule England for generations, gradually extending their power until the whole of England was united under their rule. Through Elfrith came connections to continental nobility that would influence English politics for centuries. The family ties Alfred created through strategic marriages and through raising capable children who inherited his values and vision ensured that his impact would extend far beyond his own lifetime. Alfred also cultivated a kind of extended political family through the bonds of lordship and godparenthood that medieval society considered almost as important as blood kinship. When he stood as godfather to Guthrum at his baptism, Alfred created a spiritual relationship that carried obligations and expectations. He was godfather to other nobles and warriors, creating webs of loyalty and mutual obligation that strengthened his rule. These relationships were not just formal but personal. A godfather had responsibilities to guide and support his godchildren, and they in turn owed him respect and loyalty that went beyond ordinary political allegiance. The court Alfred maintained, especially in his later years when peace allowed some stability, became a centre of learning and culture that attracted scholars from across Europe. Asser from Wales, Grimbald from Francia, John from Saxony, and others came to Winchester, drawn by Alfred's reputation as a patron of learning and by the opportunity to participate in the educational renewal he was promoting. These scholars became part of Alfred's extended family, dependent on his patronage, contributing to his projects and forming a community of intellectual pursuit that enriched English culture. Their presence meant that when Alfred's children and the children of nobles studied at the court school, they learned from the best teachers available, receiving education that rivaled anything available in Francia or Italy. The family legacy Alfred built was not just biological, but cultural and political. He created a model of what a Christian king should be: warrior when necessary, scholar by preference, lawgiver and judge, protector of the weak, patron of learning, defender of the faith. His descendants would try to live up to that model with varying degrees of success, but the ideal he established would influence English kingship for centuries. The combination of military prowess, learning, piety, and justice that Alfred embodied became the standard against which later kings would be measured, and few would measure up to Alfred's example. As the 890s progressed and Alfred entered his 50s, the accumulated toll of decades of war, constant administrative work, and chronic illness began to wear him down. The great invasion of 896 had been repelled, but the effort had exhausted him. The pain that had been his companion since his wedding day did not diminish with age, but perhaps grew worse, or perhaps he simply had less strength to endure it. He continued his duties as king, holding court, dispensing justice, managing the kingdom's affairs, but contemporaries noticed that he was slowing down, that tasks that had once been easy now required great effort. Alfred seems to have known that his time was limited and worked to ensure the kingdom's stability after his death. Edward, his son and heir, was given increasing responsibilities, training for the kingship he would inherit. Alfred made sure that the succession was clear and uncontested, that Edward had the support of the major nobles and churchmen, that no ambitious rival would plunge the kingdom into civil war when the king died, he revised his will, distributing his personal property among family members and religious institutions, making provision for Ealhswith and his daughters, ensuring that debts were paid and obligations met. These were the acts of a man preparing for death, setting his affairs in order while he still had strength. The later months of 899 must have been difficult. Alfred would have known the end was approaching, would have felt death drawing closer with each passing day, but he maintained his dignity and his faith, meeting the end as he had met every other challenge in his life, with courage rooted in Christian conviction that this earthly life was merely a prelude to something greater. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had saved his kingdom when it seemed lost, had built institutions and structures that would outlast him, had raised children who would carry on his work. If he had regrets, battles lost, reforms incomplete, goals unachieved, he also had the satisfaction of knowing that he had done more than any reasonable person could have expected, had transformed defeat into victory and saved England from conquest. Alfred died on October 26, 899, at approximately 50 years old. The cause of death was not recorded in detail, but given his long illness and the descriptions of his symptoms, it seems likely that complications related to Crohn's disease finally claimed him. Perhaps an infection that his weakened body could not fight, or perhaps simply the accumulated damage of 3 decades of chronic inflammation. However he died as King of Wessex, recognized as the most powerful ruler in England, respected by his own people and feared by his enemies, having achieved far more than the 5th son of a minor Saxon king had any right to expect. His body was taken to Winchester, his capital, the city he had fortified and made into the centre of West Saxon power. He was laid to rest at the Old Minster, the ancient church that served as the spiritual heart of Wessex. Ealhswith would join him there 3 years later when she died in 902. But Alfred had planned even beyond his death. Before dying, he had ordered the construction of a new minster, a grand church that would serve as a mausoleum for him and his descendants. It was a statement of continuity, a declaration that the royal line he had established would continue to rule Wessex, and that his family would be remembered in perpetuity. 4 years after Alfred's death, in 903, the bodies of Alfred and his family were moved from the Old Minster to the newly completed New Minster. There they would rest for over 200 years through the reigns of Edward, Athelstan, and the other Saxon kings who completed the unification of England that Alfred had begun. The New Minster became a site of pilgrimage and remembrance, where people came to honour the king who had saved England, where prayers were said for his soul and the souls of his family, where his memory was kept alive through the rituals of the church he had served. But Alfred's bones would not rest undisturbed forever. In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England, defeated the last Saxon king at Hastings, and established Norman rule over England. The Norman conquerors had little sentiment for Saxon institutions or traditions. Churches built by Saxon kings were demolished and replaced with grander Norman structures. In 1110, the new minster itself was torn down to make way for Norman building projects, and the monks moved to Hyde Abbey, just outside Winchester's walls, taking Alfred's remains and those of his family with them. At Hyde Abbey, Alfred rested in obscurity for over 400 years, his tomb maintained by monks who remembered his importance, even if the wider world had largely forgotten. Then came Henry VIII, and the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, that cataclysmic event that saw hundreds of religious houses destroyed, their treasures seized, their monks dispersed. Hyde Abbey was dissolved in 1539, its buildings demolished, its land sold off. The monks were expelled, and in the chaos and destruction, Alfred's tomb was lost. The exact location of his grave was forgotten, and his bones were scattered or buried somewhere in the rubble. For centuries, the final resting place of England's greatest Saxon king remained unknown, a mystery that archaeologists and historians try periodically to solve. In 1788, convicts building a prison on the site of Hyde Abbey disturbed graves and found bones, but which bones belonged to whom could not be determined. In the 1990s and again in the 2010s, archaeological investigations at the site tried to locate and identify Alfred's remains using modern techniques of DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating. Bones were found that might be Alfred's, but definitive proof remained elusive. The great king who had defended Winchester, who had made it his capital, who had been buried there with such ceremony, had become in death a mystery, his final resting place unknown, or at least uncertain. But perhaps the uncertainty about Alfred's physical remains is less important than the certainty about his legacy. The man is gone, has been gone for over 1100 years, his bones scattered or lost, or lying in some unmarked location. But what Alfred built, the kingdom he saved, the institutions he established, the traditions he created, the vision he articulated, all of that survived him and shapes our world still. His true monument is not any tomb or cathedral, but the nation of England itself, which exists because Alfred fought to preserve it when it seemed doomed to be swallowed by Viking conquest. Of all the kings and queens who have ruled England in the centuries since Alfred's death, he alone bears the epithet, the Great. This is not a title he claimed for himself, or that his contemporaries bestowed upon him, but rather a recognition that came later, as subsequent generations looked back at his reign and recognized its exceptional significance. The question of why Alfred earned this unique honor, when other monarchs who ruled longer or conquered more territory did not, reveals much about what truly made his reign remarkable. Military victory alone does not explain Alfred's greatness. England has had many successful warrior kings who won impressive battles. Edward III conquered Wales. Henry V triumphed at Agincourt. Edward III defeated France repeatedly in the 100 Years' War, but none of them are called the Great. Alfred's military achievements, while significant, were not fundamentally about conquest, but about survival and defense. He saved Wessex when it was on the brink of destruction, defeated Viking armies that had conquered every other English kingdom, and established defensive systems that protected England for generations. His greatness lay not in how much territory he conquered, but in how he preserved what would otherwise have been lost. Learning and culture were equally important to Alfred's legacy. While other medieval kings were often illiterate or indifferent to education, Alfred made learning a priority of his reign. He translated books himself, established schools, brought scholars to his court, promoted English as a literary language, and articulated a vision of education that went far beyond merely training clerics. He understood that preserving culture was as important as defending territory, that England's identity was intellectual and spiritual, as much as political and military. By ensuring that English learning survived the Viking invasions, Alfred preserved not just a kingdom, but a civilization. Legal and administrative reforms demonstrated Alfred's understanding that kingdoms needed more than military power to endure. His law code provided justice and consistency, creating a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining order. His Burh system did more than defend against enemies. It created towns that would become centers of trade and culture. His administrative innovations made the kingdom more efficient and capable, better able to mobilize resources and respond to challenges. Alfred thought systematically about how to strengthen Wessex in every dimension, not just militarily, but economically, legally, culturally, and administratively. The combination of these achievements, military success, cultural preservation, legal reform, and visionary leadership makes Alfred unique among English kings. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred is called the Great because he embodied an ideal of what kingship should be. He was a warrior when his kingdom needed defending, but he preferred learning to warfare and valued wisdom above military glory. He was powerful, but exercised power justly, creating laws that protected the weak rather than simply aggrandizing the strong. He was Christian, but recognized that Danes who accepted baptism could become partners rather than remaining eternal enemies. He suffered from debilitating illness, but never let personal hardship prevent him from serving his people. The title, the Great, also reflects what Alfred prevented as much as what he accomplished. If Alfred had failed, if he had died in the Marshes of Athelney, or been defeated at Edington, England as a distinct nation might not exist. The Viking conquest that seemed inevitable in 878 would have succeeded, and the island of Britain would likely have become a Scandinavian kingdom, or a collection of Danish territories with perhaps some Celtic kingdoms in Wales and Scotland. English language, English culture, English law, all would have been subsumed into Norse traditions or disappeared entirely. The England that later conquered much of the world, that produced Shakespeare and parliamentary democracy, that became the seed of the English-speaking world, exists because Alfred won at Edington and rebuilt his kingdom strong enough to resist further Viking invasions. Later, English kings understood their debt to Alfred. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, explicitly continued his father's work, building on the Burh system and military reforms to reconquer the Danelaw. Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, completed the unification of England, bringing Northumbria under West Saxon rule and creating for the first time a kingdom that controlled all of what is now England. These later accomplishments were possible only because Alfred had preserved Wessex and provided the foundation, military, administrative, and ideological, upon which his descendants could build. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century renewed interest in Alfred and helped establish his reputation as the Great. Protestant scholars looking for historical precedents for English Christianity independent of papal control found in Alfred, a king who had promoted vernacular religious texts, who had translated scripture and religious works into English, who had established an English church that could function without constant reference to Rome. This may have been a somewhat distorted reading of Alfred's actual religiosity. He was in fact quite orthodox in his submission to papal authority, but it helped establish his reputation as a founder of English nationalism and English Christianity. Victorian England, at the height of its imperial power, embraced Alfred as a symbol of English virtues and a precursor to British greatness. The Victorians saw in Alfred a king who valued education, promoted justice, defended Christian civilization against barbarians, and built an empire, all values and achievements they claimed for themselves. Statues of Alfred were erected, books about him written, his memory celebrated as part of England's glorious history. The Winchester statue of Alfred, erected in 1901 to commemorate 1,000 years since his death, depicts him holding his sword aloft, a warrior king defending England, an image that resonated powerfully with Victorian imperial ideology. Modern historians have complicated this hagiographic picture, recognizing that Alfred, like all historical figures, was a product of his time with values and assumptions we would not necessarily share. He accepted slavery as normal, viewed women as subordinate to men, believed in trial by ordeal, and saw warfare and violence as legitimate tools of statecraft. His laws, while progressive for his time, included provisions modern readers would find barbaric. His vision of a Christian kingdom excluded those who did not share his faith, and his treatment of pagans while sometimes generous to individuals like Guthrum who converted, was fundamentally intolerant of religious diversity. But even acknowledging these limitations, Alfred's greatness remains evident. He faced challenges that would have broken most people: military defeat, exile, chronic illness, the responsibility of defending not just a kingdom, but an entire civilization against seemingly overwhelming enemies. He overcame those challenges through courage, intelligence, determination, and vision, creating institutions and traditions that would last for centuries. He demonstrated that leadership requires not just personal qualities, but also the ability to inspire others, to organize complex systems, to think strategically about long-term goals while handling immediate crises, and to build something lasting rather than merely achieving temporary success. Alfred is the Great because he saved England when it was within days of ceasing to exist, because he rebuilt it stronger than before, because he promoted learning when barbarism threatened to engulf civilization, because he embodied virtues of courage, wisdom, justice, and mercy that transcend his particular time and place. He is great because no other English king faced such dire circumstances or accomplished so much with so little. He is great because his legacy shaped not just England, but the entire English-speaking world. And he is great because over 1100 years after his death, we still remember his name, still tell his story, still recognize that he deserves a place in history alongside the very greatest leaders humanity has known. That is why, of all England's kings and queens, he alone is Alfred the Great. And so ends our journey through the life of Alfred the Great, the king who saved England from the Vikings, who transformed defeat into victory, who built a kingdom that would last 1,000 years, from his birth at Wantage as a prince who never expected to rule, through the darkest days hiding in the marshes of Athelney, to his triumphant victory at Edington and the reforms that followed. Alfred's story reminds us that courage, wisdom, and determination can overcome even the most impossible circumstances. As you drift into peaceful slumber, perhaps you'll dream of burhs being built across the English countryside, of shield walls clashing on the Berkshire Downs, of a king bent over books by candlelight, translating wisdom for his people. The story of Alfred the Great has carried countless sleepers into restful dreams across the centuries, and tonight it has carried you. If this gentle tale has eased you towards sleep, please remember to leave a like when you wake. It helps others discover these calming historical journeys. And if you'd like to share which part of Alfred's story resonated with you most, or which historical figure you'd love to hear about next, the comment section would love to hear from you. Even a simple word or emoji brightens our day here at Sleepy Crown. And if you haven't yet subscribed, join our family of dreamers for more soothing history every week. Sleep well, dear friend, and may your dreams be as peaceful as England after Edington. Good night from Sleepy Crown.